Under the yellow glow of aging street lamps, the curb looked ordinary until the night cracked open. Sheriff Eli Mercer was 4 miles from home, trailing his loyal German Shepherd Shadow on his final patrol. The town was wrapped in a stillness that whispered of long winters and locked doors, where porch lights went off at 10, and no one feared waking up. But Shadow's low growl sliced through that calm as sharply as broken glass. Eli halted, eyes narrowing toward the garbage truck's jagged silhouette. He remembered that look in Shadow's eyes from years past, when explosives lay hidden and a wrong step meant death. He called out, but Shadow wouldn't budge. Then came the bark, urgent, fierce, more than a warning, a plea. And in that moment, the lid lifted, and inside lay something sorrowful and miraculous. A baby, blue, lipped, and fighting for breath. 10 feet away, Eli realized how small mercy could be, how thin the line between life and oblivion. The dog's bark had been the bridge. In the hiss of hydraulics and the reek of damp cloth, a newborn's cry sprang free, and the world tilted. That bark wasn't just noise, it was an act of faith, a promise that someone, somewhere, believed it still mattered to listen. Hold on tight, because this is the story of how one sound changed everything. The cold that night wasn't just biting, it was the kind that sank into bones, the kind that reminded you were still alive simply because it hurt to move. Sheriff Eli Mercer pulled the collar of his coat tighter as he walked down the slush-slick sidewalk, each step crunching faintly under the weight of old boots and tired legs. Overhead, the faded glow of street lamps cast long shadows on the snowbanks, dull and yellow like the memory of summer. Beside him, Shadow walked without a leash. He never needed one. At nearly 10 years old, the German Shepherd had seen more than most deputies in the department, first as a canine inch the Middle East, then as Eli's partner here in Willow Creek. Even now, long after his official retirement, Shadow moved with a precision and presence that turned heads when people were around to notice. But tonight, the streets were empty, just frost and silence. Eli had made this loop 100 times before his closing ritual, as Tara at dispatch once teased. A final sweep through town before heading home to microwave dinner and drink coffee he didn't need. It made no difference that nothing ever happened in Willow Creek after 9 p.m. routine, he'd once explained to someone who cared. Routine keeps the ghosts at bay. Shadow stayed close but slightly ahead, nose down, ears relaxed. His breath formed quick clouds in the air. Every few paces, he'd glance back at Eli, not with worry, but with acknowledgement. They didn't talk much anymore, not since Eli lost Rachel, and the house fell into a quiet that even music couldn't fill. But Shadow had a way of filling silence without sound. He always had. They turned down Mill Street, a narrow residential stretch that curved near the edge of town. Snow piled in uneven ridges where the plows hadn't cleared fully. A weak wind carried the smell of old wood smoke and distant pine. Somewhere behind a curtain, a television flickered through a window, blue and ghost-like. The world felt, held, like it was waiting for something. And then they heard it. The low mechanical hum of a garbage truck turning onto the street ahead, its headlights sweeping across the curb like a searchlight. Eli didn't think much of it. Just the sanitation crew making a late sweep, probably behind schedule because of the snow. He paused at the corner and let Shadow sniff a hydrant base, then turned to cross behind the slowly approaching truck. Its massive tires rolled lazily through the slush. A cloud of steam hissed from the engine as it paused at the end of the cul-de-sac. One of those new trucks, Eli noted the kind with the automated arm that lifts the bin and dumps it into the compactor with a mechanical roar. Efficient, he supposed. Cold, too. He gave a small tug on his coat and looked up to call Shadow, but Shadow wasn't beside him anymore. The dog stood still, rigid on the edge of the sidewalk, eyes fixed straight ahead. His ears were perked so high they almost trembled, tail stiff, body coiled like a spring. And those eyes, they weren't soft or searching. They were locked, focused, narrowed in on the back of the garbage truck. Eli slowed. "Hey," he said gently. "What is it, boy?" No response. Just that posture, that stare. Eli had seen it before, years ago, when they were sweeping an abandoned compound outside Basra. Shadow had stopped like this outside a tent flap. Moments later, They'd found a tripwire rigged to a pressure plate under a cot. It was the look that said, "Something here doesn't belong." The truck's automated arm reached for a large bin near the curb. Hydraulic claws closed with a hiss. The bin began to rise, black plastic scraping against icy pavement. Shadow took a step forward. Shadow. The dog's body stiffened, muscles bunched, his hackles lifted. Then came the bark. Not the half-hearted warning of a territorial dog, not the playful yip of a curious mutt number. This was something else, deep, guttural, from the diaphragm. It cracked open the quiet like a gunshot. Then again, and again. The truck's driver, a heavy-set man in an orange vest, climbed down from the cab, confused, glancing around. "Everything all right over there?" he called out, voice echoing slightly. Eli raised a calming hand. "Sorry, he's retired. Probably just a cent." But even as the words left his mouth, Eli knew that wasn't it. Shadow wasn't sniffing. He wasn't pacing. He was alerting. To what, though? The bin kept rising. Shadow lunged toward it, barking with a desperation Eli hadn't heard in years. Not since Afghanistan. Not since that night with the overturned convoy and the hidden IED. Whoa, hey. Eli took a step forward, heart racing. "Hey, stop the truck. Cut the arm." The driver scrambled back up to the console. The arm froze midair, the bin swaying slightly, snow flurries catching on its base. Eli moved without thinking, hand on the truck's side rail. He hauled himself up onto the rear platform, flashlight drawn. Shadow's barking now turned into a deep whine, his front paws scraping at the pavement. The cold from the bin hit Eli first sharper than the night air, then the smell. Damp cloth. Something coppery. Blood? He pulled the lid open and froze. The bark tore through the cold like a flare in the dark. It wasn't the sound itself that made Eli whip around. It was the timing. The weight behind it. A bark like that didn't come from curiosity. It didn't even come from fear. It came from something deeper, something primal. Warning. Alarm. Demand. Shadow lunged toward the edge of the curb, paws slipping slightly in the slush as he strained toward the black bin that was now halfway up the side of the garbage truck. Another bark, louder, roar. His teeth were bared, chest low to the ground, legs trembling. Eli felt his pulse rise like a tide inside his ears, his breath caught. "Shadow! Easy, what is it?" he called out, already stepping forward. The bin jerked slightly in the mechanical grip, swaying with the wind. The hydraulic arm let out a soft groan as it rose another foot, locking into its lift arc. "Stop the lift." Eli's voice cracked into the silence, cutting through the soft whir of machinery. "Hey, stop!" The sanitation driver, a man in his 50s, thick jacket, cigarette still dangling from his lip, looked over from the cab, confused. He blinked twice before reaching for the emergency brake. The bin froze midair. Shadow barked again, so hard this time his front paws left the ground for a second. He wasn't aiming at the truck. He wasn't confused. He was aimed squarely and tensely at the bin itself. His head snapped back and forth like he was tracking a heartbeat that no one else could hear. Eli didn't move for half a second, and then instinct took over. He crossed the distance fast, boots thudding through the snow. Shadow didn't even look at him. His entire being was focused upward, like something inside that black plastic shell was invisible and screaming. "What the hell's gotten into him?" the driver called, stepping down from the cab with one gloved hand on his radio. "That dog crazy?" Eli didn't answer. He was already climbing up the side of the truck, one foot on the step rail, one arm gripping the metal frame as he pulled himself up. The cold bit into his fingers. The bin hung level with his chest, its lid still half open from the mechanical arm's grip. There was no movement, no sound, just trash. And then a twitch, a flutter of something inside the bin. He leaned forward, heart hammering, and opened the lid wider. There was a towel, grimy, crumpled, bloodied at the edges, newspapers layered beneath it, soggy and torn. He peeled one back and froze. Something small, so small, curled beneath the folds of fabric. A shape, barely larger than his forearm, blue-tinged skin, tiny fists, a trembling chest struggling for breath. A baby. A newborn. A wet gasp caught in Eli's throat. For half a second he didn't move. The cold hit him harder now, the weight of what he was seeing dragging every muscle into stillness. The infant let out a sound, a fluttering whimper like wind through a crack in a window. Barely audible, barely alive. "Jesus Christ," Eli whispered. He turned over his shoulder. "Lower it. Now, M." The driver didn't ask questions. The hydraulic arm hissed and groaned in protest as the bin began descending again. Eli kept one hand on the side rail and the other gently beneath the bundle, cradling the fragile form as the bin came down. When it finally reached the ground, he leapt down and knelt beside it, tearing off his coat without hesitation. Shadow was already beside him, silent now. No more barking, just watching. Ears forward, body still. His nose hovered inches from the child, but didn't touch. He stood like a soldier guarding a wounded brother. Eli wrapped the baby in his coat, heart thudding like a drum. He didn't even notice he was trembling. The child's skin was ice cold, lips tinted blue. The sound coming from its chest wasn't quite a cry. It was too soft for that. More like the echo of one, like a cry that had already run out of strength. Hey, little one," Eli murmured, pressing the baby close to his chest, trying to share his own warmth. The driver dropped to his knees beside him, face pale. "Oh my God." "Oh my God, is that?" "Call EMS," Eli barked. "Tell them we've got a newborn. Hypothermic, breathing, but weak. No visible trauma." The man fumbled with his radio, hands shaking. "Dispatch, this is Sanitation Unit 3. We got a situation on Mill and Branch. There's a baby." Eli tuned him out. All he could hear now was the faint gasp of air from the child's tiny mouth, like life itself was unsure whether to stay or go. He looked up, his eyes finding shadows. The dog didn't blink. "You did good, boy," Eli whispered. "You did damn good." Shadow let out a low huff, quiet, satisfied, and sat down, tail brushing softly against the snow. In the distance, a siren wailed. Eli kept his arms around the baby, rocking gently on his knees. The coat was already soaked through with melting snow, but he didn't care. He was sweating through his shirt and still felt cold. The kind of cold that didn't come from weather. The kind that came from almost crushed, almost lost, almost too late. He pressed his hand to the baby's tiny back, felt the slow, shallow rhythm of breath. "Hang on, little one," he murmured. "You're not alone anymore." End of sex. Behind them, the garbage truck sat in stillness, its mouth open like it had tried to devour something sacred and failed. The bin creaked slightly as Eli pulled himself back up, fingers cold against the steel, breath fogging in the air like smoke from a fire that had almost gone out. The garbage truck hissed beneath him, engine idle now, its compactor still frozen mid-cycle. For once, the machine obeyed the stillness of the night. Eli leaned into the bin. The baby lay crumpled near the center, half buried beneath soiled towels and layers of damp newspaper. The smell was unmistakable, copper and mold, something ancient and wrong, like the stench of decay hiding inside everyday things. But all of that vanished the moment Eli's eyes locked onto the small bundle, tiny fingers, curled into translucent fists, skin too pale for comfort, a dark smear across the fabric that had once been a hospital blanket, now tattered and stained. And then, just as Eli's hand hovered above it, moved. Not much, just a shudder, like a feather caught in a breeze. But enough. "Still breathing," he whispered, not sure if he was saying it for himself or the child or the universe that had almost missed it. The sanitation driver hovered behind him, mouth open, eyes wet. "You sure?" he asked, voice barely a breath. "Yeah," Eli said, "but not for long, He reached down with both arms, moving with the kind of focus that only comes from knowing a single wrong motion might change everything. The towels were damp and cold, stiff in places where the blood had dried. He peeled them back, layer by layer, until there was nothing but fragile life beneath his hands. The baby was impossibly light. He expected weight, substance. But the child seemed made of paper and breath. Carefully, Eli cradled the tiny form against his chest and stepped down from the bin. His boots hit the pavement hard, knees bending to absorb the shock. He didn't feel the pain until later. Shadow was already there, tail low, standing sentinel beside the patch of cleared snow. His eyes were fixed on the child. No wagging, no sound, just presence. Eli had seen that look before once, outside Fallujah, when Shadow had laid his body over a wounded soldier to keep him warm until the medics came. That same stillness now, anchored in purpose. "You knew," Eli said quietly, kneeling down and pulling the coat tighter around the baby. "You heard what no one else could." Shadow didn't respond. He didn't have to. The sirens were louder now, still distant, but drawing closer. The kind of wail that slices through still air and lets the whole world know someone didn't die tonight. Eli sat on the icy curb, one arm wrapped around the child, the other pressing the coat closed against the wind. The baby let out a weak cry, thin, strained, like trying to push air through a pinhole. It was the most beautiful sound Eli had ever heard. "It's okay," he whispered, rocking gently. "You're here now. Just hold on." The driver crouched nearby, speechless. His hand hovered like he wanted to touch the child but didn't dare. His eyes flicked between the baby and the dog. "I didn't hear a thing," he said after a moment. "Nothing. No crying. No movement. It was just trash." Eli didn't answer. His jaw clenched tight. The ambulance came screaming around the corner seconds later, its lights painting the frost and windows in waves of red and white. A pair of paramedics jumped out, their footsteps quick and practiced. But when they reached Eli, something in them softened. The man with the stethoscope knelt beside him. "Newborn?" he asked. Eli nodded. "Hypothermic. Breathing, but barely. Any trauma?" "Not visible, but it's bad. Just bad." The paramedics moved fast, expertly. One unwrapped the coat, the other pulled out a warming blanket, thermal pads, a neonatal oxygen mask. The baby whimpered again and was quickly connected to a mobile monitor. A tiny beep started pulsing in the cold air, slow but steady. As they worked, Shadow didn't move. He sat like a statue carved from muscle and instinct, his breath fogging around him in slow rhythm. One of the paramedics glanced at him and murmured, "He, the one that found the baby?" Eli nodded. Would have been too late without him. The man looked at the dog with something close to reverence. "Smart dog." Eli didn't say it, but he thought it not smart, devoted. As the medics carried the baby into the ambulance, the driver of the truck sat back on his heels, hands shaking. "I've been doing this job 18 years, he said, voice cracking. "Never seen anything like that. I mean, that bin was about to get crushed. It was already moving. 10 more seconds. He stopped, swallowed, looked at Shadow. "I'll never forget that bark." Neither would Eli. He stood slowly, every joint aching now from adrenaline wearing off. The quiet was falling again, filling in the space where noise had just lived. But it wasn't the same quiet. Something had shifted in the bones of the street. Eli looked up at the ambulance, then down at Shadow, whose eyes still tracked the open doors. "You saved him," Eli said softly. Shadow looked up and gave the faintest nod, just a shift of his head. But enough. And then he exhaled, long and low, as if releasing the weight of a cry only he had heard. The child was so still that Eli had to keep one hand pressed gently against its chest just to make sure it was still rising, still falling, still there. He sat with his back to the garbage truck's tire, cradling the newborn in his arms, while the rest of the world moved in blurred streaks, paramedics swarming the back of the ambulance, the sanitation driver still pacing like he might throw up, dispatch crackling from Eli's radio with questions he didn't have the breath to answer. But none of that mattered. Not now. Or maybe it was the absence of weight. The baby felt impossibly light, like ash or memory, a fragile knot of warmth, barely stitched together by breath and will. The coat Eli had wrapped around the child was too big, swallowing most of the small form inside its folds. But the corner of a damp receiving blanket still clung to one arm, a cartoon sun half visible beneath a smear of blood. That detail stuck in his brain like a splinter. The sun. A child's blanket, left in a trash bin. His throat burned. Shadow sat close beside him, pressed tight against Eli's right leg. The dog had refused to move since the baby had been pulled from the bin. He hadn't barked again. He hadn't made a sound. He just sat there, eyes fixed on the bundle in Eli's arms like it was the most sacred thing he'd ever guarded. Eli reached down briefly with one hand and rested it on the dog's back. Shadow didn't react, but the warmth of his fur under Eli's palm grounded him. A steady, wordless reminder that the world, while cruel, could still produce miracles, even if they were held together by one last bark in the dark. The sirens had stopped now. The night resumed its grip wind, nudging down the alley. snow drifting lazily under the glow of street lamps. Somewhere nearby, a porch light flickered on, then off again. No one came out. Eli's mind wandered without permission. He kept seeing it, the bin rising in the air, shadow, lunging, that bark. It hadn't just been loud. It had been urgent. Like he knew. Not in the way dogs smell, or hear, in the way they understand. The way only creatures who've seen the worst of men, who've stood at the edge of death and walked back, can understand. He closed his eyes, just for a second, and he heard it again, that moment of stillness, that tiny flutter from inside the bin. Not a scream, not even a proper cry, just a sound soft enough to miss. But Shadow hadn't. That was the part that shook Eli most. Not that someone had thrown a baby away, but that if Shadow had been leashed, if they'd walked a different block, if he hadn't paused at the curb, the child would be gone, vanished into silence, like it had never existed. He looked down. The baby's eyelids fluttered, still closed, still pale, but the chest beneath the bundle lifted. Once, twice. A good sign. Eli leaned his head back against the tire and exhaled slowly. The metal was cold, but he didn't care. He wasn't sure how long they'd sat like this. Time had folded in on itself. The cold didn't seem to sting anymore. His fingers had gone numb, but his chest still burned. He didn't know why exactly. Maybe it was grief, maybe rage, or maybe that strange kind of quiet awe that only rises when you witness something that shouldn't have been possible. A miracle, made of flesh and breath and shivering silence. The ambulance doors creaked open again. "We're ready for him," one of the medics said, crouching beside Eli with a soft blanket in his arms. "You can come with." Eli hesitated. The baby stirred again, this time with a small gasp, a fluttering, bird-like sound. He looked down. "You hear that?" he murmured. "That's the sound of a fighter." The medic nodded, gentle. "He's lucky." Eli stood slowly, careful not to jar the bundle. His knees ached from the cold, but his grip was steady. "No," he said. "He's alive because of him." He nodded toward Shadow, who still hadn't moved, still hadn't blinked. The medic followed Eli's gaze. "Damn good dog." Eli offered a thin smile. "Yeah, always was." Together, they crossed the narrow stretch of snow-covered pavement toward the open ambulance. Inside, warm lights buzzed, casting a glow that seemed almost out of place. Clean, clinical, hopeful. Eli handed the baby over, reluctantly, his fingers lingering just a second too long on the soft, trembling chest. The medic nodded once, then turned to secure the infant into the neonatal warmer. Eli stepped back, suddenly unsure of what to do with his hands. Shadow joined him quietly, brushing against his leg like a shadow made real. His breath came in slow clouds, steady, calm now. They stood like that man and dog watching as the doors closed and the ambulance pulled away. Sirens off now, just the crunch of snow beneath its tires. And for the first time, in what felt like hours, the night returned. Empty, but not quiet. Because Eli could still hear that cry, and he knew it would never leave him. The door creaked open with the kind of groan that only came from wood swollen by winter and too many years without laughter. Eli stepped inside, the warmth from the baseboard heater brushing his boots, faint and mechanical, as if the house itself had only just remembered someone lived here. Shadow padded in first, his paws silent against the old hardwood. He didn't shake off the snow. He didn't sniff the corners like usual. He walked straight to the front door and laid down, his body between the world and the man he followed home every night. Not relaxed, not sleeping, just still. Like a sentry who knew the danger wasn't over yet. Eli closed the door gently behind him, the lock sliding into place with a soft click. The sound used to comfort him. Now it just echoed. He didn't take off his coat right away, didn't turn on the lights. He stood in the dark entryway for a long moment, letting his eyes adjust, letting his breath catch up with him. His hands were still cold, not from the weather anymore, but from the memory of skin too soft and lips too blue. He took a step forward, then another. His boots left faint prints on the rug Rachel had picked out 6 years ago. The one she said reminded her of the autumns she spent in Vermont as a kid. He never told her he thought it was ugly. Now he couldn't bear the thought of changing it. The living room was exactly how he'd left it. Always was. couch cushions slightly sunken from the weight of absence, a lamp with a missing pull chain, a coffee mug on the end table with last week's grounds still dried to the bottom, the ghost of routine. But it was the photographs that caught him tonight. He hadn't meant to look at them. Usually he could walk past the wall without his gaze catching. But something about tonight, about the baby in the bin, about the weightless bundle in his arms, had shifted the angle of his grief just enough to make it sharper. There she was. Rachel, her smile frozen forever behind the glass frame, sunlight caught in the strands of her hair like gold thread. One photo of them at the lake. One of her with Shadow as a pup, his ears still too big for his head, and one Eli's favorite, but also the one he could least bear to see of her in the kitchen, mid-laugh, a wooden spoon in one hand and flour smudged on her cheek. He reached for it without thinking, touched the glass, let his fingers hover where her smile used to live. "I'm sorry," he whispered, not because she needed to hear it, but because it was the only thing that ever came out on nights like this. He turned away. In the kitchen, the clock above the stove blinked 3:42 a.m. He poured a glass of water but didn't drink it, just held it, staring at the steam curling from the radiator. He didn't turn on the television. The silence was too full tonight, too weighted with something sacred. Like breaking it would be a betrayal. Behind him, Shadow exhaled. Not a yawn, not boredom, more like a sigh. Like he knew Eli wasn't going to bed. Like he'd already made peace with that. Eli walked to the hallway. The floor creaked. His body moved like it was remembering things his mind was trying to forget. He paused in the doorway of what had once been a nursery. They'd painted it soft yellow the summer before everything changed. The crib was still there. So were the tiny shoes that had never been worn. The books with broken spines from reading out loud to no one, just to fill the room with hope. He hadn't opened the door in months. Now it was open. Just a sliver. He closed it gently. Back in the living room, he sat on the couch, not bothering to take off his boots. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped together like a prayer he didn't know how to finish. He thought of the baby, the hospital lights, the way the infant had gasped for breath like it was unsure the world wanted it. He thought of how fragile that life had been, and how close it had come to slipping away unnoticed. Buried beneath fast food wrappers and coffee grounds, forgotten before it ever had a name. Shadow lay at the base of the door still, head up, ears twitching at every creak from the wind outside. "Can't sleep either, huh?" Eli murmured. Shadow blinked. "You think he'll make it?" A pause, another blink. "Yeah," Eli said quietly. "Me too." He leaned back and let his head rest against the wall behind the couch. He closed his eyes, but sleep didn't come. Only the image of Shadow barking against the void, a sound that shattered silence. A sound that reached into a metal coffin and pulled life back out. Eli swallowed hard. "You knew something was in there," he said softly, voice barely above the heater's hum. "You always know." Shadow didn't move, but the weight of his stillness said more than words could ever say. Eli stared at the ceiling until his vision blurred. And somewhere, far from this quiet house and the memories that lived inside its walls, a child wrapped in blankets breathed just a little easier. Alive. Because a dog had refused to look away. The wind had picked up by dawn, and with it came a biting cold that settled in the joints like rust. Eli pulled the zipper of his coat to the top, though it didn't help much. The chill this morning wasn't about temperature. It was the kind that crept under skin because something had been left unfinished. He stood on the corner of Mill and Branch. Same place as last night, only this time there was no garbage truck, no blinking hazard lights, no paramedics or cries for help. Just the quiet crackle of frost underfoot and the low hum of a town beginning to wake up behind closed doors. Shadow stood beside him, alert but not tense, ears swiveling to track every shift in the morning air. He hadn't needed prompting to get in the cruiser. The moment Eli grabbed his keys, Shadow had gone to the passenger door and waited, tail still, eyes steady, like he knew they had to go back. Something was off, something unfinished. Eli let out a long breath, watching it disappear in a white cloud. Then he clipped the leash to Shadow's collar, not because he needed control, but because it gave his hands something to do. They stepped off the sidewalk and onto the patch of curb where it had all begun. The snow here was flattened in places, boot prints, maybe, or the tracks left by the garbage bin wheels. The sun hadn't melted much yet, so everything was preserved in icy relief. But even frozen, it all looked ordinary. Deceptively so. Eli crouched beside the curb, brushing at a darkened patch with his glove. It wasn't blood, just oil. But the image it stirred in his mind was harder to clean. Tiny limbs beneath a towel, lips turning blue, Shadow's bark ripping through the dark. He shook the thought off. "You smell anything?" he asked softly. Shadow didn't respond with sound. Instead, he lowered his head and began to move, slow and deliberate, his nose gliding just above the frozen ground. Step by step, he traced an invisible thread, weaving around the sidewalk, back toward the alley where the bins had lined up last night. Eli followed, letting the leash stay loose, trusting the rhythm, trusting the dog more than he trusted his own thoughts. They passed by a mailbox with a crooked flag, then a porch still lit by a forgotten bulb. Curtains fluttered behind windows, some watching, most indifferent. The world, as always, was ready to forget. But Eli wasn't. Shadow paused. They'd reached a bend in the alley, a place where snow had gathered high against a chain-link fence. He sniffed the base of a recycling bin, circled once, then continued down the length of the fence. His tail lifted slightly. Not wagging, just raised. Alert. Eli felt his pulse shift. Shadow stopped at a rusted storm drain. His nose hovered, then pressed lightly to the concrete lip. He gave a soft snort. "You've got something," Eli murmured. He crouched again, brushing away the thin crust of ice along the metal grate. There was nothing visible inside, just a crumpled bit of paper, a gum wrapper, and the vague smell of mildew. But Shadow stood perfectly still, eyes fixed on the fence just a few feet ahead. Then he moved again, slowly now, toward a wooden post partially buried in snow. His body stiffened slightly, head low. A faint growl rumbled in his throat, low and almost apologetic, like he was alerting gently to a ghost. Eli followed the line of his gaze. There, caught on the jagged edge of the fence wire, fluttered a scrap of pale fabric. He reached out and carefully pulled it free. It was torn, smeared faintly with something brown mud, maybe, or something else. The edge was frayed, but the pattern still clung to it. Cartoon suns. The same as the blanket from last night. His fingers tightened. "Someone passed through here," he muttered. "Someone carrying that baby." He looked up. The alley stretched in both directions, empty and gray. A cat darted between trash cans. A door slammed 2 blocks away. But there was no one here. Only the trail of something desperate, something quiet. A girl, maybe, trying to vanish between streetlights. Eli stood and pocketed the cloth carefully, then gave Shadow a gentle pat. "Let's keep going." They walked the length of the alley again. Shadow sniffed along the gutters, the steps, the base of fences. At one point, he stopped and stared up at a 3rd-story fire escape, ears twitching. But no sound came. Eventually, the trail faded. The scent disappeared. Or maybe it just stopped where the footsteps had. Eli knew this kind of disappearance too well. People didn't just vanish, they were erased, one quiet choice at a time. Like names rubbed off a chalkboard, like children dropped in bins. He looked down at Shadow. The dog was staring down the block, still and steady. "You feel that?" Eli asked. Shadow didn't move, but Eli did. He turned slowly, scanning the row of houses. Something lingered here. Not guilt, exactly, not yet. But shame, maybe. The kind that keeps lights off and curtains drawn. The kind that lives in the walls when someone knows more than they're willing to admit. Eli's jaw tightened. Whoever had left that baby in the bin hadn't come far. He was sure of it now. The blanket scrap, the trail Shadow followed, the way the scent had ended just around the bend, it all pointed to someone close. Someone still hiding. The search was just beginning, but the clock had already started ticking again. The house didn't look like a place where anything happened. That was Eli's first thought as he stood at the edge of the cracked walkway, eyes tracing the sagging roofline, the gutter half torn from the eave. The paint had once been blue, maybe, but now it flaked off in long, exhausted curls like the building had stopped trying to keep up with time. The mailbox was rusted, bent slightly at the hinge. Faded black letters barely clung to the metal surface. Connor. Eli stared at the name for a moment. It meant nothing to him. Yet, Shadow had brought them here, nose twitching, tail neither high nor tucked, just poised, purposeful. They'd followed the faint trail from the alley, through a narrow cut in the fence, past a dried-up lilac bush that hadn't bloomed in years. Then he'd stopped, right here, in front of this house. Something? Eli asked softly. Shadow didn't answer, but his body was stone still. Not frozen with fear, frozen with focus. Eli stepped forward. The porch groaned beneath his boots, a tired complaint. There was a boot scraper by the door, long rusted through, and a row of planters filled with nothing but dirt and brittle stems. He bent down, more out of habit than hope, and there it was, a baby white packet torn open, half crumpled, caught beneath the edge of a broken floorboard. He reached for it carefully. The plastic was cold and stiff from the morning air, but inside, one corner of a wipe still clung to the opening. Slightly stained, slightly scented, faintly floral. He held it up to the light. She was here, he murmured. Shadow stepped forward, paused, barely making a sound on the old boards. He sniffed at the packet, then moved past it, nose now low to the ground, weaving along the porch like a needle through fabric. Then he descended the steps, slow, deliberate, and turned left into the side yard. Eli followed, slipping the white packet into an evidence bag as he walked. The side yard was narrow, boxed in by a leaning chain-link fence and the neighboring house's vinyl siding. Dead leaves clung to the base of the wall, and somewhere beneath them, water trickled from a cracked pipe. A broken lawn chair lay on its side, half buried in frost. A pink hair tie was looped around one of its legs, sun-bleached and brittle. Shadow's pace slowed as he reached the far corner, where the fence gave way to a small gate unlatched. He nosed it open gently and stepped through. Eli paused before following. This wasn't a forced entry. It wasn't a break-in. It was a path someone took carefully, quietly. Someone who didn't want to be seen. Someone who knew this property, maybe lived here, maybe didn't, but knew the path through it. On the other side of the gate, the backyard stretched out in silence. There was no grass, just dirt and frost, a few worn stepping stones, and an old shed that leaned dangerously to one side. Shadow stood in the center of it all, nose lifted slightly, ears rotating like radar. Then he began to circle, once, twice, each loop tighter than the last. Eli watched him, heart sinking with each silent orbit. He knew this behavior. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't searching for a scent. This was centering. Shadow was closing in. Eli stepped forward, his boots crunching softly against the frozen ground. "Show me," he whispered. Shadow stopped near the base of the shed. His nose hovered over a pile of damp leaves matted down beside the door. He pawed once delicately and then stepped back. Eli crouched, brushing the debris aside with gloved hands. There, half buried beneath the leaves, was a strip of fabric. Soft, worn. He lifted it carefully. A piece of a baby blanket. Cartoon suns again. This one stained along the edge with something dark, maybe mud, maybe more. He didn't need a lab to know. It was the same material, same pattern, same scent. Eli stood slowly, eyes narrowing as he looked back toward the house. Whoever had left the baby in that bin had passed through here. And not by accident. There was familiarity in the way the path curved. The open gate. The items left behind, like ghosts. He scanned the back of the house. Curtains were drawn tight over the windows. A satellite dish hung askew from the roof. No toys, no lights, no cars, but someone had been here. "Let's mark it," Eli muttered. Shadow sat back on his haunches, waiting, watching. Eli pulled out his phone and took a photo of the blanket strip in place, then bagged it carefully. He knelt again and ran his fingers along the base of the shed door. It wasn't locked, just jammed shut with a strip of weathered wood nailed across it. He didn't force it open. Not yet. He wasn't ready to spook whoever might be inside. Instead, he stood and looked out across the street rows of identical houses in different stages of neglect. None of them looked like crime scenes, but he was starting to understand something. This wasn't just about neglect. It was fear. Fear leaves different tracks than violence. Softer, slower, but just as dangerous. He turned back to the porch and glanced once more at the mailbox. Connor. He'd pull the records when he got back to the station. Cross-reference utility bills, ownership history, maybe even a quiet call to social services. Whoever lived here might not have thrown the baby away, but someone knew who did. And the walls of that weather-worn house had heard the truth. Shadow stood at the edge of the yard, ears forward, body still, waiting. "Yeah," Eli said softly. "I feel it too." The wind had stilled by the time Eli rounded the far side of the Connor property, but the air was colder, now thinner, as if something unseen had taken a breath and was still holding it. Shadow stayed close to his heel, eyes scanning low. The dog wasn't sniffing aimlessly anymore. He was tracking something faint, familiar, something that hovered just above the surface, like a ghost that hadn't fully let go. The alley behind the house was narrow, cluttered with forgotten things. An old tire, a broken rake, weeds that had pushed through cracks in the concrete and died with the season. Against the fence, 2 city-issued garbage bins sat crooked on uneven pavement. One was overflowing, its lid half ajar. The other was closed tight, a dusting of frost feathering its top like lace. Shadow slowed. His ears perked once, then lowered again, and then he stopped. Eli followed his gaze. A set of thorny shrubs lined the rear of the fence, barely more than tangled sticks now. But something was tucked into the hollow between 2 roots, just out of sight unless you were looking for it, or unless you were led there. Eli crouched, careful not to startle whatever lay hidden. It was a plastic shopping bag, worn thin from dampness, tied once at the top, but sagging under its own weight. The knot was loose, like someone hadn't had time, or hadn't cared. The bag itself was stained, part mud, part something darker. He reached for it, hesitated, then opened it slowly. The first thing he saw was fabric, a small towel, balled up and stained rusty red. Blood, no doubt about it. Not fresh, but not old either. The fibers were stiff, clumped in places, like it had been used to catch or clean something that wasn't meant to be cleaned with a towel. Beneath that was a baby bottle, cracked along the side, the nipple missing. The smell of sour milk hit him immediately, sickly, sweet, and sharp. Next, a pacifier, scratched and cloudy, the kind hospitals sometimes give out in maternity wards. It was pink, with a faded cartoon bear at the center. And finally, folded in a half-crumpled sheet of ruled notebook paper, barely protected by a second layer of plastic wrap, was a note. The ink had bled at the edges, but the words were still legible. "Please don't hate me. I had no choice." Eli read it twice, then a third time. There was no signature, no date, no plea for help. Just those words raw, stripped bare, written by someone who didn't expect to be forgiven, someone who'd already decided she wouldn't be. He let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. Shadow sat nearby, watching him carefully, tail still, body relaxed, but watchful. Not of danger, of grief. Because that's what this was, wasn't it? This wasn't the chaos of a crime of impulse. This was a trail of pain laid out with trembling hands, a baby wipe on the porch, a scrap of blanket by the shed. And now, here behind the bin, this bag of what was left after the unthinkable. Eli turned the note over, fingers tracing the soft paper. It felt like something more than evidence. It felt like a confession. He stood slowly, bag still in his hand, and looked around. The alley was still empty, just wind brushing the tops of the bins and the faint hum of a power line overhead. But he could feel her here, not physically, not anymore. But her choices lingered. The girl, whoever she was, had stayed close for a while. Long enough to leave the bag, long enough to write the note and tuck it in, like a last act of decency. Like she wanted the world to know she hadn't thrown that baby away without feeling every second of it. And if she was watching now, if her eyes were hidden behind one of these curtained windows or the slats of an abandoned shed, Eli hoped she saw the way he held that bag like it meant something. Because it did. He walked back toward the cruiser, Shadow following without a sound. The evidence bag crinkled softly in his gloved hands. Inside it, a life unraveled. Not just the baby's, but hers too. When he reached the vehicle, he opened the rear hatch and placed the plastic bag into a larger container, sealing it carefully. Then he stood for a moment longer, hand resting on the edge of the trunk. His mind kept replaying the note. Please don't hate me. He didn't. Not yet. But he needed to understand. Because wrapped inside that apology was something deeper than guilt. Fear. And fear like that didn't bloom from nothing. It had roots. He looked at Shadow. The dog tilted his head, a quiet question in his eyes. "We're close," Eli said. Shadow's ears twitched. "Someone around here knows." He continued, locking the hatch. Or saw. Or helped. Or turned away. He glanced back toward the Connor house. The windows still hadn't moved. No sign of life. But now he knew someone there had touched that blanket, that bottle, that blood. He didn't know who yet, but he would. One step at a time. With Shadow beside him, and the silence of that alley still clinging to his coat like smoke, Eli got in the car and drove back to the station with the weight of a whisper folded into a plastic bag. Back at the station, the world resumed its usual pace, quiet humming overhead, fluorescent lights casting their too white glow across file cabinets and linoleum floors that had seen too many tired boots. But for Eli, everything moved slower now, sharper, as if the night had peeled something back he hadn't yet put away. He sat at his desk, gloved hands moving carefully as he cataloged the contents of the plastic bag he'd recovered behind the Connor house. Each item went into its own sterile evidence, pouch labeled, dated, sealed. His pen scratched across the intake form. Location found. Alley behind 17 Mill Street. Connor residence adjacent. Exhibit A. Enfant pacifié. Pink. Cartoon bear design. Exhibit B. Cracked baby bottle. Interior residue consistent with milk spoilage. Exhibit C. Blood-stained towel. Cotton fiber. Exhibit D. Handwritten note, ink smeared, partial legibility. Contents. Please don't hate me. I had no choice. He paused after writing that last part. There was something about those words that didn't fit the pattern of a panicked teen hiding a mistake. No frantic scribble. No begging. Just resignation. I had no choice. People who say that don't run because they want to. They run because someone made them believe they had to. He stood, sealed the evidence bag, and walked it down the hall to forensics. As he passed the front window, sunlight broke through the clouds for a split-second soft gold on snowbanks and rooftops. It should have looked beautiful. But to Eli, it felt like light landing in the wrong places. He pushed open the door to the forensic intake room. Sarah Myers, mid-42nd, sharp eyes behind square glasses, looked up from her microscope. "Got something?" she asked. "Couple things," Eli replied, placing the sealed container on the tray. "Priority run. I need material analysis, blood typing if you can get it, fiber trace, and ink analysis on the note." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "That part of a missing persons case?" Eli shook his head. "It's part of something no one's willing to name yet." She didn't press, just nodded. "I'll get it on the bench this afternoon. You want a full digital copy of the note?" "Please. And enhance it if possible. Some of the ink bled." He lingered in the doorway for a beat longer than necessary. Sarah noticed. "You look like you've got more to say." "I do, just not to you." He managed half a smile, turned, and left the room. Back in his office, he slid into the worn leather chair and reached for his phone. His thumb hovered for a moment over the contact list before scrolling to a name he hadn't called in 6 months. Lang. Tara. DCS Liaison. Child Welfare Investigations. She picked up on the second ring. Lang. "Tara, it's Mercer. Franklin PD." A pause. "You calling to finally apologize for bailing on coffee last spring?" He allowed himself the faintest chuckle. "Number, but I'm calling because I've got something I think falls under your wheelhouse. And if I'm wrong, I'll buy that coffee and name my firstborn after you. That tempting, huh? All right, hit me." He told her everything, starting with the baby in the bin, the blanket, Shadow's alert, then the wipe at the Connor porch, the fabric scrap by the shed, the bag behind the bushes, and finally, the note. Tara didn't interrupt. She rarely did. When he finished, there was silence. Then, "You think someone's covering for her?" "I don't know yet." But the movements were too careful. No panic. Just despair. "You've got age on the infant. Newborn. Less than 48 hours old when we found him." "You think it's a teenager?" "Feels like it. But more than that, it feels like someone convinced her she didn't have a way out. Tara's voice dropped half an octave. You think coercion? I think shame doesn't write notes like that. Fear does. She exhaled slowly on the other end of the line. All right, let me make a few calls. If that house is in our system, it won't stay quiet for long. Thanks, Tara. One more thing, she added before hanging up. Mercer, if it is what you think it is, you're not dealing with just a scared girl. You're dealing with a system that taught her silence. He hung up, her words lingering in the room like fog. A system that taught her silence. He stared out the window at the snow, beginning to fall again, dusting the cruiser parked below. Shadow sat in the passenger seat, still as ever, eyes scanning the street like he could read the wind. Eli opened the bottom drawer of his desk and pulled out a worn leather folder, thin but heavy with names that had once meant something. Reports of domestic disturbances that never led to charges. Welfare checks that never went deeper. Foster home audits passed because no one looked too close. He flipped to the C tab. Connor. There it was. Harold Connor. Retired. No priors. Foster license expired 3 years ago. House still registered under his name, but no recent updates. No children listed. No complaints filed. No anything. Too clean. Which was never a good thing. Eli leaned back, rubbing the bridge of his nose. It wasn't abandonment. It wasn't even desperation. It was invisible. And whoever had put that child in a garbage bin had been taught to believe invisibility was safer than being seen. He looked again at the transcript of the note Sarah had already emailed to his inbox. The digital enhancement made the words clearer, but no less haunting. Please don't hate me. I had no choice. He whispered the line once to himself, and then, out loud, who convinced you that was true? The footage was silent. That was what made it worse. New wind, new footsteps, new sobs. Just grainy black and white shadows recorded by a doorbell camera bolted to the porch of 19 Mill Street 3 doors down from the Connor property. The timestamp read 3:17:40, 2 ampere. M. Eli sat in the small viewing room at the station, elbows on his knees, shadow curled beside his chair like a living statue. Across from him, the neighbor Mrs. Audrey Lohman, late 70s, cardigan buttoned unevenly, holding her thermos like a fragile relic, watched the screen with her lips pressed tight. I never check these things, she muttered, voice trembling more from the weight of memory than age. My son installed it after someone siphoned gas from my car last spring. I only saw this because you asked about movement between 2 and 4. Eli nodded. You did the right thing, ma'am. She gave a tired smile. Doesn't feel like enough. On the screen, the static flickered briefly, then movement. A figure stepped out of the alley, small, wrapped in a hoodie that reached almost to the knees. The street lamp caught the shape just enough to make it clear. Young, thin, shoulders hunched, not from cold, but from the kind of exhaustion that lives in the bones. The person moved carefully, slowly. One hand gripped a plastic bin, the same type used for garden waste in this part of town, now repurposed as something far more horrifying. The other hand cradled the lid, as if afraid it might open too soon. Eli's jaw tensed. There was a limp, subtle, but there. The right foot dragged slightly. Pain? Fatigue? An old injury? Whatever it was, it made the figure look even smaller, even more breakable. They reached the curb. 3:17:50. 8 ampere. M. The figure lowered the bin. Not dumped, not thrown. Lowered. Like something precious still lived inside it. Then hesitation. The figure turned back to look at it, still holding the lid. There was no sound, but Eli could feel what was happening. That pause wasn't logistical. It was emotional. A fracture. The weight of what had just been done colliding with the gut realization that there was no going back. He leaned closer to the screen. Then it happened. The girl, because that's what she was now, undeniably turned just slightly. Not enough to show her whole face, but the angle of her jawline caught the streetlight just long enough to illuminate soft skin. Too young to carry that much fear. A child. 15, maybe 16 at most. Her mouth moved. A whisper. Or a prayer. Or maybe just the air collapsing out of her lungs. Then she stepped back, turned, and walked away fast, not running, not calm, just gone. 3, 18, 23, et Monsieur Elie hit pause. The image froze with the girl mid-stride, 1 foot off the ground, the sleeve of her hoodie trailing like a flag of surrender. It was the last clean frame before the night swallowed her whole. Audrey pressed her thermos to her chest. She looked so tired. Eli nodded slowly. Yeah. Do you think she wanted the baby to die? He turned to her, eyes firm. I think she wanted the baby to be found. If she wanted to disappear it, she wouldn't have picked that spot. Wouldn't have waited until the truck was seconds away. Wouldn't have stood there long enough to cry. Audrey's hands trembled. Then why didn't she leave him at the church? Or the fire station? They still have those boxes, right? Because someone made her believe she didn't deserve help. Eli's voice came out quieter than he expected. Because whatever pushed her to that moment convinced her she was disposable. He stood and hit export on the video file, saving it to the secure drive. The footage would go to forensics, to facial analysis, and to every patrol officer in a 15-mile radius. But deep down, Eli knew that no software would be able to tell him what Shadow already understood. This wasn't about a runaway. This was about a silenced girl who had run out of places to whisper the truth. As he gathered his things, Shadow stood and stretched, then nudged Eli's leg with his nose. He hadn't barked once since they entered the room, but his eyes hadn't left the screen. Did you see something I didn't? Eli asked, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. Shadow leaned into the touch. Eli turned to Audrey. Thank you for your help. You might have just given that baby a name. She didn't smile, just nodded, tears in her eyes. Back in the hallway, Eli walked in silence, the file drive in his coat pocket, his mind somewhere else entirely. The timestamp etched itself behind his eyes, 3:17 ampere. He remembered the exact second Shadow barked. It matched almost to the second. Somehow, he had heard her. Not her footsteps, not the bin, but her pain, her fear. And that was the part Eli couldn't explain, couldn't log, couldn't print in a report. But he'd seen it, and he'd felt it, and so had the dog. They reached the cruiser. Eli opened the door and looked back once more toward Mill Street, where a child had stepped out of the dark and left behind everything she thought she couldn't keep, and then vanished. Not because she wanted to, but because she thought no one would come looking. Eli climbed into the car, set the drive on the passenger seat, and looked over at Shadow. We're looking now, he said quietly. Shadow blinked once, and then turned his head toward the road ahead. The second time Eli stepped onto the Connor property, the cold felt heavier, like it had settled into the wood of the porch and refused to leave. The search warrant was tucked into his coat pocket, but it felt unnecessary. No one had claimed the house since the first visit. No lights, no vehicles, no footprints except the ones he'd left days before, already softened by snowfall. The silence that wrapped around the place wasn't just absence, it was avoidance. Behind him, Shadow sniffed the frozen ground in slow, wide arcs. The dog's movements weren't hurried. They were deliberate, focused, as if whatever they were meant to find wasn't buried in dirt, but in something far deeper. Fear, maybe. Or memory. Eli moved through the front door with a quiet creak. The air inside was stale, untouched. The floorboards groaned, even beneath his cautious steps. The living room was empty, except for a faded recliner and a pile of unpaid bills scattered near the fireplace like forgotten confessions. He wasn't here for the living room. He followed Shadow through the kitchen and out the back door. The shed stood at the far end of the yard, half swallowed by a tangle of thornbush and the sagging weight of time. Its hinges had rusted down to orange crust. One of the windows was cracked, the jagged edge rimmed with frost. Eli stepped closer. Shadow stopped beside him, ears up, body tense. You smell it? Eli whispered. The dog didn't move, just stared at the base of the door. Eli tested the handle. It gave with a reluctant squeal. The inside of the shed was narrow and dark, with a broken lawnmower hunched in the corner like a dead beetle. Dust clung to every surface, disturbed only by the faintest impression of movement. Someone had been here not recently, but not long ago either. On a wooden shelf, under a paint-stained tarp, Eli found a cardboard box. Inside were tiny baby clothes, pale pink onesies, a pair of knit booties, a swaddle blanket, that had once been white. He picked them up one by one. They were folded with care, not like something discarded, like something hidden. A lump formed in his throat. Then he saw it tucked beneath the blanket, slipped between layers like a secret not meant to be found. A notebook, spiral-bound, with bent corners and smudges of dirt across the cover. He opened it carefully. Most of the pages were blank, but in the margins, where a child might doodle or a bored student might scribble, there were scattered lines. Half-thoughts. Fragments. I watched the moon and wondered if it knew. I can't keep lying to her, but I don't want him to come back. He said he'd hurt the baby if I told. Eli stared at that last line, written in shaky pencil. The pressure varied mid-word, like the hand that wrote it trembled, like the writer wasn't sure they'd survive the sentence. He closed the notebook slowly, holding it as gently as if it were a living thing. Behind him, Shadow let out a low whine. Ellie turned. The dog was standing near the back wall, one paw lifted slightly, not hurt, but hesitant. There was a tarp crumpled against the boards. Eli stepped over and pulled it back. There behind the tarp was a small mattress, thin, frayed at the edges. A few crumpled wrappers, an empty water bottle, a pack of diapers, only 2 left inside. A makeshift nursery. Not a safe one, not a warm one, but the only one she had. The breath caught in Eli's throat. He crouched, running a hand along the wall above the mattress. Scratched into the wood, faint but deliberate, were more words. Not written in ink, but etched by fingernail or knife tip. Don't cry when you sleep. He hears. Eli stood and backed away slowly, his heart pounding. Not from fear, but fury. A quiet, seething kind that didn't shout. That sat heavy in the chest and turned every heartbeat into a vow. Shadow nudged his leg gently. We're not just looking for her anymore, Eli said aloud, the words slow and steady. We're pulling her out. He bagged the notebook, the baby clothes, the blanket. All of it. Evidence of presence, of love, of fear, of a girl who tried to mother in the shadows because the light had teeth. As he stepped out into the fading daylight, snow began to fall again, soft, soundless. Eli turned back once toward the shed. Somewhere in that space, a girl had whispered the truth to a notebook because no one had been listening in real life. Somewhere in there, she'd tried to be brave while the world failed to be kind. No more. He closed the shed door behind him. Then he and Shadow walked through the yard, not with urgency, but with purpose. There was a predator out there, and a child who believed monsters were real, because she'd met one, and they'd both left tracks. The streets of Willow Creek were asleep again. Snow fell softly over parked cars and bare-branched trees, cloaking the town in a hush that felt deeper than silence. Eli Mercer walked the block with Shadow, pacing beside him. No leash, no command, just quiet understanding. There was something about the way the dog moved tonight, more alert, more cautious, as if he knew they weren't just patrolling anymore. They were looking for someone who wasn't sure she wanted to be found. The streetlights buzzed faintly, their golden halos bending in the light snowfall. Most windows were dark. Only the occasional blue flicker of a television danced behind frosted curtains. But Eli wasn't watching the windows. He was watching the corners, the spaces between, the places where a scared girl might hide. Shadow veered off the sidewalk and trotted toward the alley behind the Connor house, nose low, ears sharp. Eli followed without a word, boots crunching softly over the salted pavement. A row of dumpsters lined the back of the alley, half buried in snowbanks. Behind them, a concrete wall pressed against Shadow's like a secret that didn't want to be spoken. And then they heard it. A whisper. Barely audible. I didn't want to hurt him. Eli froze. Shadow stood motionless, tail stiff, eyes locked on a point behind the farthest bin. Eli stepped forward slowly, hands loose by his sides, voice low and steady. It's okay. I'm not here to hurt you. No response. But the whisper had been real. A human voice. A young voice. June? He said, trying the name he wasn't sure of. June Harper? The snow shifted behind the dumpster. Then, like a broken branch straining under too much weight, she emerged. A teenage girl, thin as a shadow, and wrapped in a threadbare hoodie too small for the cold. Her hair was tangled and matted beneath the hood. Her jeans were soaked up to the knees. She wore no gloves. Just one sock. And in her arms, pressed against her chest like something she couldn't bear to part with, was a blanket no baby inside now, just the memory of what she had carried in it. Her lips trembled, not just from cold, but from something deeper, the kind of trembling that doesn't stop when you go indoors. Shadow didn't move. He simply sat, lowering his body slowly, eyes never leaving the girl. June looked at him, then at Eli. "You brought the dog," she said, voice barely a breath. "His name's Shadow," Eli replied gently. "He's the one who found your baby." The girl blinked, and something cracked in her eyes, a dam held together too long. "Is he—" her voice faltered. "Is the baby alive?" Eli nodded. "Yes, he's okay. Breathing. Warm. Safe." That word, safe, seemed to hit her harder than anything else. She stumbled back and slumped against the brick wall, hands shaking, the blanket still clutched tightly. The moment she stopped trying to hold herself upright, the cold swallowed her, her body going limp with exhaustion, her knees beginning to fold beneath her. Eli stepped forward instinctively, catching her under the arms before she fell. She flinched, but didn't resist. Her skin was like ice. Every muscle in her frame felt like it had been clenched for days. "We need to get you warm," Eli murmured. "Let's go." "I didn't know what else to do," she choked. He said he'd kill me, or him, or both." Eli didn't ask who he was, not yet. Instead, he shrugged off his heavy sheriff's coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. It swallowed her whole. "I believe you," he said softly. She looked up at him then, eyes wide with disbelief. "No one ever says that. I'm not no one. And I've got a dog who's a better judge of people than most judges I've met." Shadow came closer. He didn't sniff her, didn't bark or demand attention. He simply nudged his head under her elbow and stood there, warm and solid, anchoring her. June's breath hitched. She reached down, tentative, unsure, and let her fingers graze the thick fur along Shadow's back. "He's warm," she whispered. "He's yours now," Eli said. "At least for tonight." She said nothing more, but she didn't pull away when he guided her toward the cruiser parked at the end of the alley. She didn't resist when he opened the door and helped her inside, Shadow curling into the footwell beside her. She didn't even ask where they were going, and maybe that was the saddest part, how used to not asking she had become. Eli sat in the driver's seat, took one last look at the alley behind them, and started the engine. For the first time in hours, the cruiser's heater hummed warm air through the vents. June leaned back in the seat, her face pale and hollow beneath the passing lights. "Do you want to tell me what happened?" Eli asked gently. "No," she said. "But I think I need to." And from the back seat, Shadow lifted his head, ears twitching. Outside, the snow kept falling. But inside the cruiser, for the first time in a long time, someone was listening. The sheriff's office in Willow Creek wasn't built for moments like this. It had a few desks, a coffee maker that groaned more than it brewed, and a soft hum of fluorescent lights that never quite reached the corners. The holding room wasn't a cell, just a small room with a chair, a table, and walls painted a tired shade of beige. But to June Harper, it might as well have been a courtroom, or a trap. She sat in the corner, knees drawn up to her chest, wrapped in a wool blanket someone had offered but she hadn't really accepted. Her hood was down now, hair limp and tangled. Her face was unreadable, not defiant, just closed, like a book too damaged to risk opening again. Eli stood on the other side of the observation glass, arms folded, shoulders heavy. He hadn't said much since they brought her in. There was nothing to accuse her of, and everything to understand. Shadow lay quietly at his feet, eyes fixed on the girl. He hadn't barked, not once. "I think she's waiting," Tara Lang said beside him. The child welfare detective had been called in late, a dark-haired woman with sharp eyes softened by years of watching trauma pass through too many young faces. "Not for us. For something else." "Note." Eli nodded slowly. "She asked about the baby last night." Tara glanced at him. "You have anything that could help her believe he's okay?" He reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a printed photo from the hospital. The baby swaddled in fresh white blankets, hooked to monitors but pink-cheeked eyes shut in peaceful sleep. A nurse's finger rested on his tiny palm. In the background, someone had scribbled on a board in dry erase, "He's strong. He's safe." Tara studied it. It might be the only thing she needs right now. Eli stepped into the room. The door clicked gently behind him. No boots thudding, no voice raised. He walked to the far end of the table and laid the photo down like it was made of glass. "I thought you should see this," he said softly. June didn't look up, not at first, but the silence did what no question could. It drew her eyes, inch by inch, toward the paper. She leaned forward slowly, then all at once, like falling. Her fingers reached for the photo, trembling before they even touched it. When they did, her breath caught. It wasn't a sob, not a cry, just a sharp gasp, the sound a heart makes when it realizes it's still beating after being told it wouldn't. Her thumb traced the corner of the image. The blanket, the small fist, the board. "Safe," she whispered, so quietly it barely made it past her lips. Shadows stirred behind Eli, not approaching, just listening. "I didn't want to leave him," June said, her voice brittle as frost. "But he said if I told anyone, if I screamed during labor, if I even looked scared, he'd take him. Or worse. He told me no one would believe a girl like me." Ellie stayed quiet. Sometimes silence was the only safe place for the truth to land. June kept her eyes on the photo. "He made me keep everything quiet, even the pain. I gave birth in the back room. No doctors, just me and a towel." He stood outside the door. Eli's jaw tightened. He didn't interrupt. "I begged him to let me bring the baby somewhere warm, just for a night. He said no, said I'd run, said he'd find me no matter where I went." She shook her head, teeth clenched. "But I ran anyway. I wrapped him in the cleanest thing I had and ran barefoot through snow. I was shaking so hard, I almost dropped him. I thought if I put him in a trash bin, someone would find him. People check their bins. I'd read that. I thought they'd hear him cry." She closed her eyes. "But he didn't cry." Eli stepped closer. "He didn't cry, but he barked." June opened her eyes. "What?" "Shadow," Eli said, gesturing toward the glass. "He's retired now, but used to be a K-9 officer. He's the one who found the bin, wouldn't let me pass, wouldn't stop until I opened it." June turned slowly, and through the observation glass, she saw the old German shepherd still, dignified, watchful. "Some part of him just knew," Eli added quietly. June wiped her cheek. "Do dogs believe in people?" "I think," Eli said, voice gentle, "they believe in what we hide." "Am true." She looked back down at the photo, and something shifted in her, not relief, exactly, and not forgiveness, but the smallest kind of release, like loosening a knot that had been tied around her ribs. "I thought he'd die," she whispered. "He didn't." "And now what?" Her voice was hoarse. "Am I a criminal? Am I going to jail for trying to save my son?" Eli shook his head. "We're not here to punish you, June. We're here to protect you." And to figure out how a girl ends up alone in the cold with a baby she had to hide. She stared at him, the doubt still clinging, but thinner now. Shadow stood, padded to the door. He let out a quiet huff, not a bark, just breath. June turned to him again. "Can he come in?" Eli opened the door. Shadow stepped in slowly, tail still, eyes soft. He approached her, not like a dog greeting a stranger, but like one recognizing pain he'd once felt. He settled at her feet, placing his chin on her boot. And June, barely 16, scraped raw by life, let herself reach down and run her hand through the old dog's fur. Her voice cracked, quiet as falling ash. "Thank you for barking." June sat hunched over in the corner of the interview room, clutching the wool blanket tighter around her shoulders, even though the room wasn't cold. Outside the glass, the town was waking up slowly, streetlights flickering off, distant tires hissing over damp pavement, unaware that inside this building, a child had finally begun to speak. Eli sat across from her, notepad untouched, pen still capped. Shadow lay under the table, head resting across his paws, his presence quiet but grounding like a steady heartbeat in a room filled with bruised memories. June stared at a chipped spot on the wall. Her voice was low, careful, like she'd learned long ago that words could be dangerous if they weren't measured right. "He was my 6th placement," she began. "I was 12. They told me Russell and Marlene Bragg were a good fit for older teens. Clean record, church-going, lived on a big property just outside of town." Eli listened, didn't interrupt. At first it wasn't bad. She made meatloaf. He fixed the water heater himself. They said grace at dinner. Her eyes flicked up, hollow. But after a while, she stopped looking at me, like I didn't exist unless there were caseworkers visiting. And when they did, he smiled so big it made my stomach hurt. She rubbed her thumb against her palm, over and over, trying to rub something away. He'd wait until she was gone. Said he was just checking if I was behaving. But it wasn't checks. It was hands. It was door locks and me trying not to make a sound. Eli leaned forward slightly, his hands folded. "Did you ever tell anyone?" June gave a small, bitter laugh. "I wrote it on a school bathroom mirror once. RB touches me. Someone cleaned it before the second period ended. I told a teacher once. She said maybe I was confusing attention with affection. She looked down, and when I did try to tell my caseworker, Russell told her I'd been having episodes, made up some lie about past trauma hallucinations, and said I needed medication." She paused, then added, "They put me on Lexapro. I wasn't even depressed. I was scared." Eli clenched his jaw. His pen still hadn't moved. He didn't need it to. "I tried to run once. Took a Greyhound as far as Miles City. But the system always catches you when you're a minor. They brought me back the same day. Told me I needed to stop making up stories. He said next time I tried to run, I'd disappear." She wiped her nose with the corner of the blanket. I stopped trying. Eli finally spoke, his voice quiet, but solid. "And the pregnancy?" She hesitated, then nodded. "I found out in August. He knew before I did. I think he was watching my cycle. Told me it was my burden to carry because I had brought it on myself." Her lip trembled. "He said no hospital, no prenatal visits. He gave me crackers and old vitamins. Locked me in the basement when I started to show." Eli's voice dropped. "He made you give birth alone?" "In the laundry room. On a pile of towels. I bit through my sleeve trying not to scream." Her voice cracked. "He waited upstairs. I thought he was going to take the baby when it was born, or worse, but he left the door unlocked, just for a few minutes. I think he wanted to see if I'd break, so I ran. I didn't even have shoes." Shadow let out a slow breath, the sound barely more than a whisper. "I thought I could get the baby somewhere safe. Somewhere someone would find him. I knew I couldn't keep him. Not like that. Not there." "Him?" Eli nodded slowly, the ache in his chest thick and deep. "You did more than most adults would have managed," he said. She looked at him, eyes red but steady. "Do you believe me?" "I believe you. Even if no one else did before?" "I'm not them," Eli said. "And you're not invisible anymore." For a moment, the room was quiet except for the soft hum of the heater and the faint stir of Shadow's fur as he shifted closer to her chair. "You said something last night," Eli added after a beat. "Something about not wanting to hurt him. That's still true?" June nodded without hesitation. "He's the only thing I ever did right." Eli stood, then walked to the door and opened it gently. Tara Lang waited just outside, her arms folded. "She's ready," Eli said. Tara stepped in, notepad in hand, but her tone was warm. "June, we're going to take you to the Child Advocacy Center. There'll be people there who listen, not just write things down. And you won't go back to that house." June's shoulders loosened just slightly. Eli glanced back at her one last time before leaving. "You brought him into the world, June, but you also gave him a future," he said. "That matters, more than you know." As the door closed behind him, Shadow stayed curled at her feet. And for the first time in what felt like years, June let her body settle without flinching, as if, just maybe, the system that had cracked around her might finally start holding something whole. Eli's house felt different once the door closed behind June Harper. Not warmer January, air still seeped through the century-old woodwork, but softer, as if the walls themselves exhaled at the sight of a teenage girl who had run out of places to run. He led her down the narrow hallway, past the photographs of Rachel and the lake, and that half-laughed moment frozen in time. June's eyes lingered on none of it. She moved like someone afraid to touch the air, afraid it might break. The wool blanket from the station was draped over her shoulders, trailing like a cloak stitched from exhaustion. "Guest room's this way," Eli said, voice low enough for late-night quiet. The small bedroom still smelled faintly of sawdust from when he'd repaired the window last fall. A twin bed sat against one wall, old quilt, fresh sheets. On the dresser, a ceramic lamp shaped like a lighthouse cast a muted glow, leaving the corners gentle with shadow. June stepped inside and hesitated at the threshold, fingers tightening on the blanket. "It's yours tonight," Eli assured. "Bathrooms across the hall. I'll leave a towel out. If you need anything, just knock." She nodded but didn't move further. That's when Shadow padded in, no hurry. No announcement, his nails whisper-tapping across the hardwood. He paused beside June, looked up, and wagged his tail just once. Slow. An invitation, not a demand. June's shoulders relaxed a fraction. She reached out, tentative, brushing her knuckles over the dog's fur. Shadow leaned into the touch, settling the space between them with quiet certainty. Eli watched the exchange, something loosening in his chest. He'll stay if you want him to. He's a shameless bedhog, though. A ghost of a smile touched her mouth, barely there. But there. I'd like that. All right, then. Eli nodded toward Shadow. Guard duty. Oh? The shepherd trotted to the side of the bed and curled in a half-moon, chin on paws, amber eyes fixed on June. The blanket around her shoulders slid to the floor as she sat on the mattress, fingers thread-picking at the quilt seams. Eli turned to leave, but her voice stopped him, small, raw. "Sheriff, can dogs tell when people are good?" He faced her. The question hung in the dim light, fragile as dust motes. "I don't know if good's the right word," he said slowly, "but Shadow listens to what we don't say. Fear, guilt. Hope he hears it in the way we breathe." June's gaze fell to the dog. "So he knew about me?" "He knew someone needed him," Eli answered. "That's enough." She swallowed, nodding as if storing the thought someplace safe. "Try to get some rest," he added. "You've had more than one night's worth of storms." As he closed the door part way, Shadow's eyes flicked to him, an unspoken promise that the watch would be kept. Eli left it ajar, the hallway nightlight spilling a sliver of gold onto the floorboards. He retreated to the kitchen, set water boiling for tea he probably wouldn't drink. Every cupboard click felt louder in the hush. Through the window, he saw snow weighting the branches, the porch lights silvering each flake. Behind him, the house creaked old bones settling around new inhabitants. Eli leaned on the counter, palms flat, and let the silence grow thick. Inside that stillness, images returned. June's trembling hand on the photo, Shadow's bark cleaving the night, a newborn's fist closing around a nurse's finger. He inhaled slow, exhaled slower, grounding himself in the rhythm. A soft thud startled him. He turned to find Shadow in the doorway, tail swishing alone. "You abandon your post already?" he whispered. Shadow chuffed, then trotted back toward the hallway. Eli followed. At the guest room door, June stood barefoot on the threshold, quilt wrapped around her shoulders this time. Her eyes were red, but when she spoke, her voice had steadied. I can't sleep. The house is too quiet." Eli nodded, remembering nights when quiet felt like drowning. "I keep decaf coffee and hot chocolate. Take your pick." "Hot chocolate," she said, almost shy. They returned to the kitchen. Steam soon curled from 2 mugs, hers dotted with fading cartoon snowmen, his plain navy blue. June cupped hers in both hands, savoring the warmth more than the drink. Eli rested against the counter. "You're safe here," he repeated, not as reassurance but as fact. "In the morning, Tara will set up a place for you and the baby together. Warm beds, counselors who actually listen. Until then, this roof is yours." June nodded, staring into the chocolate. "I keep thinking I'll wake up back in that basement, like none of this is real." "It's real," Eli said. He tapped his chest lightly. Shadow wouldn't let it be anything else. At his name, the dog lay down between them, sighing content, yet vigilant. June smiled, a small curve that didn't reach the bruises under her eyes but tried. "Thank you for believing me." Eli's throat tightened. "Thank him. He does most of the believing around here." She reached down, scratched Shadow behind one ear. Then, "Thank you, Shadow." The shepherd closed his eyes, leaning into her hand. No words needed. After a few minutes, Eli rinsed the mugs. "Try the bed again. I'll stay up a while." June set the empty cup in the sink, gathering the quilt around her like armor. Just before leaving, she paused. "You said he listens to what we don't say." Eli met her chaze. "Yeah." She nodded once, as if that was an answer to a question she hadn't voiced. Then she returned to the guest room, Shadow padding after her. Later, when Eli finally eased into the worn sofa, he heard the faint creak of the bedroom door opening once more. Then the soft pat of paws returning to the hall. Shadow appeared, trotted to the living room threshold, and lowered himself onto the rug halfway between Eli and the girl, guarding both. Eli smiled into the darkness. Outside, the storm quieted. Inside, two heartbeats, one scarred by war, one scarred by life, kept time with a third, smaller pulse sleeping miles away in a neonatal crib. And through it all, a dog's gaze held steady, seeing not the things spoken, but the truths that lived in whisper-soft silences. In that house, at least for one fragile night, fear had somewhere else to be. The pediatric wing of St. Mary's slumbered beneath soft fluorescence and the quiet pulse of monitors. Theo, just 2 days old, slept peacefully inside his incubator. But at 6:13 a.m., peace fractured. A security guard appeared at the nurse's station. "Ma'am, is there a patient named June Harper on this floor?" The nurse stiffened. "She's a minor, in protective custody, no visitors. No name, no ID, mid-50s. Wouldn't take his hood off. Said she's expecting him." Her hand drifted to the alert button. "That's stalking behavior." The guard nodded grimly. "PD's looped in. Just checking kids still in the incubator?" She nodded, glanced toward Theo. "Move him to Nursery B, lock code red. Page Officer Mercer." Eli was in the cruiser when the call came through. He'd just dropped June off at the Advocacy Center. Shadow, his aging German Shepherd partner, stirred beside him as Eli floored the gas. 7 minutes later, they entered St. Mary's like a storm. A paused security feed showed Bragg gaunt, hooded, fingers clenched on the counter. "That's him," Eli muttered. "He vanished from this camera," the guard said. Shadow growled low, staring at the screen. "Find him," Eli said. Shadow angled toward the service corridor, nose down. They moved through vending alcoves and cold stairwells until they reached P2, a dim, diesel-stained parking level. There, between two pillars, Bragg stood beside a sedan, trunk open. "Russell Bragg, hands up," Eli barked. Bragg turned slowly, hood slipped back, eyes settling not on Eli, but on Shadow. "You again," he rasped. "That mutt cost me everything. Hands, now." Instead, Bragg pulled a folded paper from his coat and let it flutter to the floor. "A letter. She left me nothing but this," Shadow growled, taking a step forward. Bragg sneered. "Little whore ruined me." Eli's voice dropped. "On your knees, now." Bragg's gaze flicked toward the stairwell. He moved. Shadow lunged. They hit the car together. Eli followed, disarming and cuffing Bragg before he could rise. Shadow stood over him, teeth bared, eyes burning with judgment. Later, inside a holding room, Bragg sat silent. Eli slid a photo of the hospital timestamp across the table. "If you ever come near June or that baby again, Shadow won't bark first." Bragg stared at the wall. "Are they safe?" Eli asked the nurse supervisor. "They are. Moved. Locked down." Outside, dawn broke. The predator was in chains. But 3 days later, Bragg vanished from custody like he melted into shadow. Eli's home turned into a fortress. Patrol cars circled. Deputies checked windows. June rarely spoke. Shadow never slept. One night, Eli stepped onto the porch into falling snow. Shadow appeared beside him, tense. Eli placed a hand on the dog's back. "You smell him?" he whispered. Shadow didn't move. That was answer enough. Inside, June sat on her bed, staring at the floor. "Do you think he's gone?" she asked. Eli hesitated. "We haven't seen him, but we're watching." "That's not the same as safe." "No," he admitted. "But Shadow sees what we don't." She nodded. "Waiting feels like suffocating." "I know." "When you caught him, did he say anything about Theo?" "Nothing that matters. Theo is safe, because of you." "Do you think he'll ever know?" Eli leaned in. "He'll know his mother made sure he lived, that she mattered." June swallowed hard. "I want to believe that. It's already true." As he left, Shadow remained sentinel at her feet. Downstairs, Eli checked his phone. A message blinked. "No hits. Bragg's vanished. Like he was never here." Shadow padded back into the room, lay at Eli's feet. "Still nothing?" Eli whispered. Shadow exhaled. Slow. "Not nothing. Waiting." It started again on Craven Street. Eli and Shadow had taken a long walk through the edge of town, restless, patrolling instinctively. When they reached a boarded-up duplex, Shadow froze. Rigid, ears pricked, body coiled. Eli followed him off the sidewalk. The porch creaked. The door was unlocked. Inside, rot, nicotine, and quiet malice. Shadow moved without hesitation, down a narrow hall, stopping at the back bedroom. Eli stepped in and saw it. Red marker across the wall, words shaking with restrained violence. "You think you savage hair." Eli didn't speak. Boot prints marred the dust. A half-eaten protein bar. Cigarette butts. Same off-brand as the shed site. The marker ink was fresh, no more than 14 hours old. Shadow sniffed a floor vent, then growled. Not out of threat, out of certainty. Eli crouched beside him. "He's circling." Shadow looked up. He never stopped. As they drove away, Eli called it in. "Full forensic sweep at 319 Craven. Message on the wall." He glanced at Shadow in the rearview. The dog sat tall, gaze fixed on the road ahead. Eli's voice dropped. "Let's find him. Before he writes again." "Oh." The snow returned behind them, erasing tracks, but not intent. The hunt wasn't over. It had just become personal. The wind had sharpened by midnight. Cold crept in through the seams of the cruiser like it was alive, slipping between the dashboard vents and licking at Eli's collarbones. He adjusted the blanket he kept stashed behind the seat, not for himself, but for the lost dogs he sometimes ferried home on bitter nights. Tonight, it lay folded across his lap, as much ritual as comfort. Outside, the shelter was quiet, too quiet. The windows of the intake wing glowed a soft yellow. Somewhere inside, June was asleep, or trying. A deputy sat 2 doors down, sipping lukewarm coffee and watching shadows like they meant something. Another cruiser idled across the lot with its lights off, engine humming low. They rotated shifts every 90 minutes. No one was taking chances. Bragg was still out there. Eli hadn't been home in 3 days. Instead, he slept in the cruiser, within reach of June and the baby. He told himself it was duty, but the truth was more human than that, more broken. He couldn't stand the thought of waking to another call that came too late. Shadow lay in the passenger seat, head resting on Eli's thigh, breath slow but not deep, the kind of rest that came with one ear open, the kind that knew night could lie. At 17 a.m. Shadow's body stiffened. Eli didn't move, but his eyes snapped open. Shadow was already upright, paw braced against the dashboard, hackles barely raised, tail frozen midline. He wasn't barking, not yet, but his whole body whispered a word Eli had learned to trust. "Now." "What is it, boy?" Eli murmured, already reaching for his radio. He peered through the windshield, wiping away condensation with the back of his hand. The lot looked empty, silent, normal. But Shadow growled a low, guttural warning that came from the ribs, not the throat. Eli stepped out into the cold, boots crunching against the frost. "Unit 12 to all posts," he radioed in a hushed voice. "Shadow's alerted. Eyes up. Something's here." "Copy that, Sheriff," came the response from the south post. Eli let Shadow lead. The dog's nose skimmed the wind, then dipped to the asphalt. He pulled toward the west side of the shelter, the side where the fencing met the storage shed. The cameras didn't catch everything there. Eli had requested new equipment 6 times in 2 years. Budget cuts, paperwork, excuses. But Shadow didn't need wires or batteries. He only needed scent. Eli rounded the corner just as the wind changed direction. Shadow froze. A faint click echoed metal on metal. Something small, subtle. Eli's flashlight snapped on, a glint near the fence. Shadow lunged, not violently, but with purpose, paws thudding softly as he guided Eli to the source. There, tucked behind the propane tanks, was a duffel bag. Black, newer than everything around it, zipper slightly open. A torn corner revealed duct tape and rope coiled like waiting snakes. Shadow growled again, this time louder. Eli knelt, heart hammering. "Unit 12, he said, pressing the radio tight. "I've got something behind the west fence. Gear bag. Looks prepped." "On our way," came the reply. But Eli was already moving. He scanned the fence. Beyond the tree line, nothing stirred. No breath. No branches swaying. But the cold had grown deeper, like it had swallowed something. He checked the ground near the bag. Fresh footprints, larger than his, leading away. Shadow, track. The dog took off slow, steady, careful. He wasn't running. He was reading. Every step a sentence. Every pause a comma in the trail. Eli followed, boots careful not to crunch too loud, breath clouding in bursts. They moved past the back of the shelter, then up toward the wooded slope where deliveries sometimes came in. The air here was heavier, older, like it had seen things before and remembered them too well. Shadow stopped near the edge of the trees. Eli stepped beside him. There, etched into the bark of an old sycamore, was a single mark, an X, fresh, carved, shallow but deliberate. Below it, in the snow, a crushed cigarette still burned faintly. He's here. Eli turned slowly, every muscle tight. The woods stared back, but nothing moved. Not yet. They returned to the lot just as the deputies rounded the corner with flashlights. "I want this place locked down," Eli ordered. "Double the perimeter and check the trees. He's scouting, setting up." One deputy nodded, already on the radio. Eli looked back at the shelter. The baby was safe. June was safe. For now. But this wasn't over. Shadow circled once, then settled by Eli's boot, still watching the dark. "You knew," Eli said softly. Before the air even changed. Shadow didn't respond. He didn't have to. Some dogs bark when danger comes. Others listen when the silence changes shape. Eli leaned against the cruiser, eyes on the woods. He wouldn't sleep tonight. None of them would, not with the X still bleeding on the tree. It happened in a blink. A blur darted past the alleyway, low, fast, human. Just enough light from the flickering street lamp to catch the flash of movement, the ripple of a dark coat hugging a hunched frame. Shadow didn't wait for a command. He launched forward with a sharp, guttural bark that cracked through the stillness like glass shattering on tile. Eli's heart spiked. The radio on his shoulder crackled as he tore after the dog, boots slipping briefly on the frost-slick pavement. West Alley, he shouted into the radio, breath already burning his throat. "Shadow's in pursuit. Suspect on foot." The figure ahead cut between two dumpsters, knocking over a stack of crates that splintered across the alley in a clatter. Shadow leapt clean over them. Eli followed, slower, his flashlight beam bouncing with every step. The suspect veered left at the end of the alley, slamming a shoulder into the chain-link fence that led toward the industrial yard behind the shelter district. He was fast, desperate, but he was limping that same dragging step they'd seen on the Ring camera footage. It was Bragg. Shadow closed the distance. "Get on the ground," Eli roared. "Hands where I can see them." But Bragg didn't stop. He rounded the last row of buildings, vaulted over a low loading ramp, and disappeared behind a warehouse where delivery trucks slept like metal giants under the moonlight. Eli reached the dock seconds later, lungs heaving. Shadow had him cornered. The dog stood taut, blocking the narrow space between a truck's bumper and the chain-link wall. His growl was low and endless, rumbling from deep within. His ears were forward, tail rigid, eyes locked. Bragg was trapped. He stood with one hand raised halfway, a poor excuse for surrender, and the other behind his back. "Don't." Eli varned, sidearm drawn, stepping closer. "I didn't do anything," Bragg rasped, voice like wet gravel. His hood had slipped down. In the dim light, Eli could finally see him clearly. Pale skin stretched too tightly over sharp cheekbones. Eyes sunk deep in his face, rimmed red with sleeplessness or rage. He looked less like a man, more like something cornered and feral. Shadow barked once, loud, close. "Drop what's in your hand," Eli said firmly, raising his weapon. Bragg didn't move. A bead of sweat rolled down Eli's temple, caught in the chill air like a second heartbeat. "I said drop it." Bragg's hand moved too fast. In that instant, everything narrowed. The world, the cold, the space between breath and bullet. But before Eli could fire, Shadow lunged. The German Shepherd hit Bragg square in the ribs, teeth catching his jacket as they tumbled against the concrete. Bragg cried out, not in pain, but in fury, and swung the object in his hand. It clattered against the ground with a dull metallic sound. A utility knife, open. Eli was there in 2 strides. He kicked the weapon aside, grabbed Bragg's wrist, and pinned him hard against the wall with one knee pressed into his back. Bragg struggled, spitting curses that tangled in the air like smoke. "You don't get to disappear," Eli said through clenched teeth. "Not tonight." Shadow circled once, then stood guard, never taking his eyes off the man who'd threatened a girl, a baby, and every line of decency left in the world. Backup arrived seconds later. Flashlights, boots, voices. Deputies pulled Bragg to his feet. His coat was torn where Shadow had latched onto it. Blood darkened the fabric near his shoulder, but not much. Shadow had held back. Just enough to stop. Just enough to save. As they cuffed him, Bragg looked up. "I could have done worse," he hissed at Eli. "You think locking me up changes anything?" Eli said nothing. He didn't need to. He just looked at Shadow now, calm, breath steady, ears perked but no longer raised. Watching. Always watching. 20 minutes later, Bragg was in custody. Driven away in a cruiser under the amber glow of morning beginning to stretch across the rooftops. The frost was melting. Eli sat on the loading dock, elbows on his knees. Shadow rested beside him, head low but alert. "Good boy," Eli whispered, voice hoarse. The dog blinked once, leaned his weight gently into Eli's leg, not for reward, but for reassurance. The chase was over. But the story wasn't. Inside the holding cell, the flickering fluorescent light above gave Bragg's skin a sickly hue. He paced in tight, twitchy circles, like a man whose leash had finally been yanked after years of roaming unchecked. There was blood on his sleeve, dried and brown, from where Shadow had torn through his coat. His hands were cuffed behind his back, but his mouth was still very much free. "You think you saved her?" Bragg sneered, eyes wild with something between contempt and mania. "You think dragging me in here means she's safe now? She doesn't belong to anyone but me." Eli stood just outside the bars, the booking paperwork in one hand, his badge catching the faint gleam of overhead light. He said nothing yet. He didn't need to. Shadow sat at his heel, unmoving, a black statue with burning eyes. Bragg leaned forward, chains clinking. "She came to me. You get that? Her own family didn't want her. System chewed her up and spat her into my house. Mine. She knew the rules. She wanted to stay." Eli's jaw tensed. Bragg chuckled. "You cops always thinking you're saving someone. She liked the attention. Even after the baby, she—" Shadow let out a low, guttural growl. Not loud, not theatrical, just final. Bragg paused. The sound cut through the room like a wire under pressure, snapping loose, quiet but deadly. Shadow didn't move. His head was low, ears forward. A warning born of instinct, not training. A sound that said, "You've said enough." For a moment, the bravado slipped from Bragg's face. Eli stepped closer. The cold in his voice came not from anger, but from the weight of something much older. Disappointment, maybe. Or loss. "Her name is June," Eli said evenly. "She's 17, a ward of a system that failed her. She gave birth alone, under threat of violence. Wrapped her baby in a rag and left him in the cold because you told her no one would believe her. He held up the evidence bag with the note, "Please don't hate me. I had no choice." "That's not love," Eli said. "That's fear." Bragg's nostrils flared. "She was mine." "No," Eli snapped. "She was your victim, not your daughter, not your property, and not your secret to bury." He stepped back as the officer behind him opened the cell door with a metallic clang. "You lost her the moment she realized your silence wasn't love, just control." Bragg barked a bitter laugh. "She'll come back. They always do. She's broken. She needs someone like me." At that, Shadow rose, walked forward, slow, deliberate. He stopped just at the edge of the open cell, looked Bragg straight in the eye. Didn't growl, didn't bar his teeth. He just stood there still, watchful, as if weighing a soul without words. Bragg tried to hold the gaze. He couldn't. His eyes shifted away, to the floor, to the cuffs, anywhere but the dog. Eli spoke low, steady. "This time, you don't walk away. He motioned to the deputies. "Take him!" They moved in without a word. Bragg didn't fight. Maybe he'd already lost the only thing he ever thought he controlled. Later that night, Eli stood outside the station beneath a bruised sky. The moon was veiled behind thin clouds, casting the world in a soft, haunted glow. Shadow sat beside him, ears perked but relaxed now, as if even he could feel the change in the air. Eli reached down and scratched behind his companion's ears. "You knew before I did," he murmured. Didn't bark at the monster. Just waited for him to reveal himself. Shadow blinked slowly. His silence was an answer. Inside the station, the clock ticked past midnight. A new day, a new chance, and for June, maybe for the baby too, a start not built on fear. The courtroom was colder than June remembered. Not from air conditioning, but from silence, the kind that lingered in polished wood and tight shoulders. The kind that made even brave voices question themselves. She sat at the witness stand, hands clasped, a blue sweater draping her thin frame. A fading bruise peeked from beneath her jaw. No makeup, no polish. Just 17 years old, and unbreakable. Eli sat behind her, shadow at his feet. The bailiff hadn't objected. Special circumstances, the judge said, and no one disagreed. Russell Bragg sat across the aisle. No cuffs, but everything about him looked restrained. Tight, ugly. His suit hung like a lie. His eyes scanned exits. The prosecutor's voice was calm. "Miss Harper, can you tell the court what happened on the 5th of December?" June glanced at Eli. He gave her nothing but quiet presence. She inhaled and spoke. She told them about the cold foster homes, the hands that lingered too long, the baby born behind a shed in silence. She told them about the threats, the note, the blood, about how Bragg had said the child was a weapon, that no one would believe a girl like her. "I didn't leave him to die," June whispered. "I left him to live." The defense objected. "Emotional manipulation." The judge didn't blink. "Let her finish." The evidence spoke louder. Bruises, gaps in school, CPS reports, DNA proof. Security footage showed Bragg at the hospital. No ID, no excuse. Then Eli testified. His voice only broke once. "Shadow didn't just find the baby," he said. "He found the girl." Bragg never looked up. The jury returned in 34 minutes. Guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced him to life. No parole for 25 years. June didn't cry. She simply breathed for the first time in years, freely. Outside, winter sunlight broke through the clouds. Eli stood beside her on the steps. Shadow pressed against her heel. "You did it," Eli said. June shook her head. "He almost broke me." But something barked louder. She looked at the papers in her hand, not heavy, but trembling. Inside, her name, signed beneath a judge's words. A line in ink that changed everything. Provisional guardianship granted. In the family court annex, June sat in a folding chair, smoothing the edge of the form again and again. Across from her, Eli waited no longer, just an officer, just Eli. A man who had carried a newborn into light. Wrapped in her arms, Noah stirred, tiny, blinking, then settling as if her heartbeat was the only one that ever mattered. They debated the decision. Social workers raised concerns. She was too young, too hurt. But when asked what she wanted for her son, June answered without flinching. "Peace," she said, "and a name that lets him belong." Now, in this quiet hallway with vending machines humming nearby, she whispered to Eli, "I named him Noah. It means rest, after the storm." Eli nodded. "It suits him." "And June?" he asked. "My mom picked it because she hoped something would bloom in me, even if she couldn't stay." Eli smiled gently. Then she was right. A knock broke the silence. Dr. Malik from Child Services stood with a clipboard and kind eyes. "You'll have weekly check-ins," she said, "but the placement is yours. Mr. Rowan remains the emergency sponsor. We believe in you." June stood, taller now. Not straighter, she'd always had that. Just steadier. Outside, Eli helped her with the car seat. He fumbled with the straps. "You ever do this before?" she teased. "Once, long ago." He didn't finish the thought. He didn't have to. His wife's photo still sat above the fireplace. Her laughter still echoed in rooms only he could hear. When they got home, something shifted. Shadow met them at the door, ears alert. He stepped beside June and gently nudged the blanket. June knelt. "Do you know who he is?" she asked softly. Shadow said nothing, just stayed close. "That's your boy too," she whispered. That night, there were no candles. No celebration, just soup on the stove, the hum of the heater, and 3 souls under one roof. June sat holding Noah by the window as snow began to fall, quiet, like forgiveness. She turned to Eli. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you think I'll ever feel like I'm enough?" Eli walked over and knelt beside her. You didn't run. You didn't give up. You stayed. That's more than enough. Shadow sighed, content beside them. June leaned close to Noah and whispered something he'd only ever hear from her. Your name means hope, but tonight, you're my reason to stay. The morning ceremony wasn't for cameras. A white tent stood outside the courthouse, folding chairs arranged in neat rows. No headlines, just neighbors, teachers, children holding parents' hands. At the front, June sat with Noah asleep on her chest, his fingers curled like unopened petals. The sheriff's office presented an award not for bravery, but for endurance, for the voice of a girl who broke a silence older than she was. Shadow lay at her feet, unmoving, watchful. When they called her name, June stood. The applause wasn't loud, just steady. Like rain on a roof you're no longer afraid will collapse. Eli stepped forward and offered her the certificate. She didn't look at it right away, just at him. Thank you, she whispered. For what? For not treating me like a case. For seeing me. Eli looked at Noah, then back at her. You made us see. She stepped back to her seat, eyes shining, voice strong. A new chapter had begun, not clean, not easy, but real. And real was enough. Shadow sat beside her, still, alert, regal without effort. He wasn't muzzled, didn't wear a vest, just his collar faded leather, engraved with a single word. Shadow. That was enough. He didn't need anything else to remind those gathered who he was. Sheriff Eli Rowan stood a few steps behind, in his dress blues. He'd shaved, pressed his uniform, but his eyes still held the weight of nights where nothing had been clean or ceremonial. His left hand rested gently on his holster, not out of habit but reverence, as if holding something in place that couldn't be named. Mayor Linford, a silver-haired woman in a navy jacket 2 sizes too large, stepped forward to the mic. She didn't clear her throat, didn't start with politics. She simply looked at Shadow and smiled. There's a story, she began softly, that most of you have heard by now, about a January morning, a trash bin, a silence that should have been final but wasn't, and a bark that broke it. The crowd didn't shift or murmur. They listened. One bark, she repeated. That's all it took. One bark from a dog who didn't need permission, who didn't need proof, who just knew. She turned her gaze toward Shadow. He didn't blink, didn't flinch. His ears flicked once at the sound of a baby's hiccup. That bark, she continued, saved 2 lives. One too small to cry, one too brave to ask for help. And in doing so, it reminded this town of something we often forget, that some guardians walk on 4 legs, and some stories are only told because they chose to stay. June's eyes glistened. She tightened her hold on Noah, who stirred gently in his blanket. Mayor Linford nodded to the deputy beside her. He stepped forward carrying a small navy box, simple velvet, unadorned. She opened it. Inside, the Medal of Valor gleamed beneath the morning light. It wasn't flashy, just a silver star surrounded by a ring of oak leaves, and at its center the etched silhouette of a dog mid-stride. Beneath it, the inscription, For Courage Beyond Command. Eli knelt beside Shadow. I don't know if you understand medals, he whispered, but I think you understand what it means to be seen. He fastened the ribbon around Shadow's neck. It sat just beneath the collar, resting against his chest like it belonged there. The crowd stood not all at once, not rehearsed, just slowly, quietly, as if the air itself had risen with them. A little boy near the back held up a cardboard sign in red crayon. You saved him, now he saves us. Shadow didn't bow, didn't bark. He just sat there, tail curled around his side, amber eyes scanning the crowd like he was still on duty. After the applause faded, June stepped forward. She didn't speak into the microphone, just stood beside Shadow and placed a soft kiss on his head. Thank you, she whispered, and somehow that felt louder than everything else that day. As people began to leave shaking hands, wiping eyes, handing off thermoses of cider, Eli remained by Shadow's side for a long time, saying nothing. Then, as if sensing something beyond the crowd, Shadow stood, turned toward the street, and walked beside Eli toward the cruiser. Before they got in, Eli looked down. You've done enough, he said quietly. "But if you're still up for it, there's more out there." Shadow tilted his head. And for the briefest moment, the kind that lives only between two creatures who've bled under the same sky, it felt like he nodded. It had snowed that morning, not the kind that blanketed streets or brought out shovels, but just enough to powder the eaves and hush the town. Eli stood on the front porch, coat unzipped, letting the breath of winter touch his skin. Behind him, the sound of a car door clicked softly, followed by quiet footsteps and the rustle of something soft being lifted out of a car seat. June approached slowly, cradling Noah against her chest. The infant was bundled tight in a worn fleece blanket that had once belonged to Eli's wife, the same one they used to wrap their niece in when she visited for Christmases that now lived only in photo frames. June's eyes met his. No words, just the unspoken question of, "Is it really okay?" Eli nodded once and stepped aside. "He doesn't cry much," she said softly, as if explaining something sacred. "But when he does, it's like he remembers where he came from." The door creaked as they entered. The heat from the old radiator had already softened the walls. A faint scent of pine cleaner and coffee lingered in the hallway. Shadow was the first to appear, his gait slow but purposeful, ears tilting forward the way they always did when something delicate crossed the threshold. He didn't bark, didn't sniff. He simply approached, paused a few feet away from June, and looked up. She knelt slowly, keeping one arm around Noah. "Do you remember him?" she whispered. Shadow stepped closer, lowered his head toward the blanket, and exhaled, long and low. Noah stirred and blinked once, his tiny hand flexing into the soft fur now brushing his cheek. The dog didn't move again, just stayed there, as if claiming the space between them as his new post. "Crib's in the guest room," Eli said gently. "It's not much, but the window catches the sun around 9 a.m. every day. He'll like that." June followed him down the short hallway, Shadow right behind. Inside, the room was small but clean, a faded blue rug, a rocking chair near the window, and a simple white crib with a quilt folded over the side hand-stitched daisies on one square, a patch with the name Leah on the other. Eli noticed June looking at it. "She was my niece," he said. "She passed when she was 7. I couldn't bring myself to pack it away." June didn't say anything. She placed Noah into the crib gently, kissed his forehead, then stepped back. Shadow immediately settled beneath the crib, curling his body close to the floor, tail tapping once, then going still. It felt like the room exhaled. That night, the house no longer echoed. Eli made dinner, grilled cheese, and canned tomato soup. June offered to help, but ended up just sitting at the table, sketchbook in hand. Her pencil moved slowly at first, hesitating with each line like it was afraid to break something. Then, the shapes came clearer. A rounded moon. The outline of a dog beneath it. Gentle eyes. A thick tail curled at its side. At the top of the page, in shaky letters, she wrote, "Guardian." When Eli placed a mug of warm cider beside her sketchbook, he glanced at the drawing. "That's good," he murmured. "Really good." June shrugged a little. "I used to draw all the time, before the group home, before—" Her voice trailed off. She didn't need to finish. Eli didn't need her to. They ate in silence, the kind that wasn't awkward, just shared. A kind of silence that acknowledged what had come before, and what might, cautiously, begin again. After dinner, Eli found himself watching them more than usual. June had carried Noah back to the crib, now asleep. She adjusted his blanket, hummed a tune without lyrics. Shadow remained at his post, head resting on his paws, eyes flicking upward only when she moved. "You trust him," Eli said softly from the hallway. June turned. "More than I trust most people." Eli nodded. "Me too." Later that night, Eli sat by the fire with a cup of tea. The flames crackled low. Old jazz played on a record player, scratchy and full of ghosts. Shadow eventually wandered out, stretched, and lay beside Eli's boots. For a long while, they didn't move. "She's safe now," Eli said, mostly to himself. Shadow didn't stir. But when June tiptoed into the room in her socks and placed the drawing of Shadow under a magnet on the fridge, the dog lifted his head, watched her, then returned to sleep. The mornings came earlier now. June stood at the kitchen counter, tracing vocabulary flashcards with the edge of her thumb while Noah sat nearby on a bouncer, chewing gently on a teething ring. The kettle hissed softly on the stove, and behind her, sunlight poured in through the narrow window above the sink, painting everything with that gentle golden hush that only happened around 6:30 a.m. Shadow lay by the doorway, eyes half-lidded, ears always listening. A few months ago, June didn't know what a GED form looked like. Now she had a folder with tabs labeled math, writing, science. She even underlined things in pink. Miss Cartwright from the Adult Learning Center had lent her a highlighter, and June never forgot to give it back. She was careful now with things, with time, with herself. Eli had offered to drive her every Tuesday and Thursday to the center. On Wednesdays, they stayed in, and she'd sit at the old dining table doing fractions, while Eli fed the baby. Sometimes, when Noah wouldn't stop crying, Eli would just put on jazz music and sway him slowly in the living room. It worked better than any pacifier. "Try again," Eli would say when she got a test question wrong. Not with judgment, just like someone who believed she could, like someone who'd once been saved and hadn't forgotten what that felt like. There were parenting classes, too, one every Saturday at the outreach clinic. June hated the first one, too many eyes, too many words, like infant attachment and positive reinforcement. But she kept going. She learned how to burp him, how to track feedings, how to read tiny signs of distress in a cry. And when Noah first reached for her, really reached, she almost broke down right there in front of the nurse. "I didn't think I'd ever be anyone's safe place," she whispered to Eli that night. He only said, "You already are." Nights were the hardest, though. Not because of the exhaustion. That she'd come to accept. Not even because of the past, which still visited her in flickers, a sound, a shadow, a door creaking open too slowly. It was the quiet that unsettled her most. The kind of quiet that made your thoughts too loud. She slept on the couch often, out of habit more than comfort. Noah's crib was still close in the guest room. But there was something reassuring about being near the hallway, near the front door, like she was guarding the threshold between what was and what might be. Shadow would always lie close. No leash, no command, just presence. That night, Noah had finally drifted off, around 2:14 a.m. The moonlight spilled over the living room like silver lace. June sat on the floor with her knees pulled to her chest, back against the sofa. Shadow lay beside her, head resting on his paws, the steady rhythm of his breathing louder than the clock on the wall. She reached out slowly and placed her hand between his ears. He didn't move, just blinked once, like he understood. "I used to dream about disappearing," she whispered. Not in a dramatic way, just fading. So quiet that nobody noticed I was gone. Shadow exhaled. She leaned closer, her voice softer now. "But then you barked," she said. "You barked like I mattered." "I?" The tears came, silent but sure. "I know you were saving him, but you didn't just save him." She paused, her thumb gently circling behind his ear. "You saved me, too." Shadow shifted, just slightly enough to press his head gently into her palm. In the other room, Noah stirred but didn't cry. June smiled through the blur in her eyes. "I'll be okay," she promised him. "I don't know how yet, but I will." The dog didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence had always been enough. The next morning, June poured formula like muscle memory. She caught herself humming the same lullaby her birth mother used to sing before everything turned to shadows. When Eli came into the kitchen, still groggy and halfway through tying his boots, he noticed something pinned to the fridge, a new sketch. It was Noah in his bouncer, and beside him, Shadow curled with one paw stretched forward like a sentinel. Above the drawing, she had written in careful block letters, "Safe." He turned, found her by the stove, Noah in one arm and a bottle in the other. "You drew again," he said. June looked up. "It felt right." Eli gave a quiet nod. Then he poured 2 mugs of coffee, one for him, one for her. The silence between them that morning wasn't heavy. It was something else. Something like hope. It was nearly midnight when Eli stepped out onto the porch, a mug of coffee in his hands, the kind he no longer drank for caffeine, but for the warmth it lent to fingers still calloused from a lifetime of holding on. The porch light hummed softly behind him, casting a pale amber glow that spilled out across the steps and down to the walkway. The town was quiet, the kind of quiet unique to small places after hard storms and harder stories. The stars had returned, one by one, blinking into place like hesitant truths. Inside, the house wasn't sleeping. Not really. Through the window, He could see the living room where June was curled up on the couch, a blanket draped over her shoulders, a parenting manual open but unread in her lap. Her head nodded slowly with the weight of exhaustion. She'd been trying to memorize formula portions. Again. Beside her, Noah slept in his crib, a hand curled into a tiny fist, one foot sticking through the bars like he was dreaming of running already. And Shadow, that dog, that damn dog. He lay at the threshold between them, eyes open, breathing steady, as if standing guard over something far more sacred than sleep. Eli sipped the coffee, let the silence settle. There were moments brief, almost weightless, when time seemed to lose interest in keeping count. This was one of them. He glanced at the old rocking chair next to him, its paint chipped, a soft layer of dust still hugging its arms. Miriam used to sit there. She'd talk to the moon like it was an old friend. Sometimes she'd just hum. No words, no tune. Just a sound that filled the spaces his silence couldn't. It'd been 3 years since he'd lost her. Cancer, swift and merciless. He remembered holding her hand in that sterile room, the machines beeping softer as her grip faded. He'd promised her, in that final hour, that he would keep going. But until recently, he hadn't known what that meant. Not really. He was sheriff. He wore the badge. He did the work. But after the funeral, the house had become quieter than death itself. And every good deed felt like going through motions carved by someone he no longer recognized. Until a dog barked behind a garbage truck. Until a girl, barely more than a child, left a baby, wrapped in bloodied rags. Until survival cracked open into something more. Now, this house, his house, breathed again. Not loudly, not perfectly, but honestly. He watched the porch light cast long shadows across the walkway, and for the first time in a long time, he noticed the warmth of it, how it reached, not just outward, but inward too. Back inside, June shifted, pulling the blanket up with one hand as her head tilted and landed gently against the back of the couch. The parenting manual slid to the floor with a soft whisper. Eli didn't move. Instead, he looked beyond the porch to the yard, where a few wildflowers had started growing again. Miriam's lilies. He hadn't watered them. They just came back. Like memory. Like breath after drowning. And maybe that's what all this was. Not healing. Not yet. But breath. June had called Shadow a guardian. But Eli saw it differently. The dog hadn't just protected. He had believed. In the silence. In the fear. In the moment when no one else was looking, he barked. And that bark had become a lifeline. Eli stepped off the porch quietly and crossed the gravel, stopping at the edge of the grass. The night was cool. A light breeze moved through the pines at the edge of the property, and he could hear an owl somewhere far off. The town would wake in a few hours. Someone would burn toast. The mail would be late again. Life, in all its ordinary glory, would return. But tonight, something different had taken root. He wasn't just the man who found the baby, or the man who arrested a monster, or even the man who lost his wife. He was the man who'd opened his door not out of pity, but because something deep inside him recognized the shape of a second chance, and he'd taken it. The porch light flickered slightly just once before settling back into its glow. Eli turned, stepping back up the creaking wooden steps. Before going inside, he paused, hand on the doorframe. Through the window, Shadow looked up. For the briefest moment, man and dog simply held the space between them. No words, no commands. Just the shared understanding of what it meant to stand watch over something fragile. Then Eli opened the door. He set down his mug, turned off the porch light, and let the warmth of the house wrap around him like a promise. The snow began to pull back its grip on Willow Creek in the quietest way, not with drama, not with thunder, but with small surrenders. Drips from the eaves, soft earth rising beneath boot prints. The pond behind Eli's house, long frozen and forgotten, had begun to breathe again in patches of open water. It was spring, not in full bloom, but in whisper, the kind of spring you had to believe in before you could see. Shadow stepped through the slush, his paws silent, nose twitching at the scents released from the thaw. He moved slower now, not from age, but wisdom, a knowing pace, as if each step had meaning. Eli watched from the porch, coffee in hand, his breath no longer fogging in front of him. The chill was retreating, though it still lingered in the corners beneath porches, along fences, inside hearts not fully ready to thaw. Inside the house, the sound of Noah's laughter, small, bright, unguarded, drifted through the open screen door. June was with him on the rug, helping him stack blocks. Her sleeves were pushed up, a faint ink smear on her wrist where she'd been drawing again. The dark beneath her eyes hadn't left, but it had softened, turned human. Eli didn't move. He just stood, like the house itself, solid through all the storms. Like the trees in the backyard, still bare, but not dead. Just waiting. Willow Creek was changing. The roads had thawed, and for the first time in months, the salt trucks were parked idle. The paper boy no longer wore two coats. At the diner, folks sat near the windows again, as if trying to catch glimpses of whatever this new season might bring. But not everyone moved on. Some stayed exactly where they were, like rocks half buried in earth, stubborn and needed. Eli was one of them. He went to work. He filed reports. He nodded at neighbors. But inside, something in him remained anchored, not in grief, not anymore, but in watchfulness, in a kind of reverent stillness that only those who had held both death and life in the same week could understand. Shadow would often rest beneath Noah's crib during nap time now, ears twitching at every sigh or stir. The boy had stopped crying in his sleep. June had stopped waking with a gasp. The nightmares still came sometimes, but they had edges now, borders. They didn't swallow her whole. And Eli, he had started doing something he hadn't in years. He had started writing her name again. Miriam. Not on tombstones, not in official records, but in memory. On yellowing recipe cards, he found her notes, "Needs more time," or "Don't forget the lemon zest," and he smiled without breaking. Sometimes June found him in the garage, sitting beside the old rocking chair, sanding its arms, not speaking. And she didn't ask. She just left a cup of tea by his side. It was enough. One morning, while the sun hadn't fully risen, Eli stepped into the backyard with Shadow trailing close. The trees were budding tiny green bursts like promises whispered through bark. Near the fence line, something had sprouted where the lilies had been, something that hadn't grown there before. A single crocus, purple, delicate, braver than it looked. He crouched beside it, brushing away a stray leaf. And just like that, it came to him. The sound of Miriam's laugh. The way her hands used to trace pictures in the soil, drawing imaginary gardens in spring. "Look," he whispered, more to the wind than to anyone. It came back. Shadow nudged his shoulder, then settled beside him. And for a long time, they stayed like that, a man and his dog, sharing silence like scripture. Later that week, Eli drove to the courthouse not as sheriff, but as a witness. He watched June sign the final guardianship papers for Noah, her hands trembling but sure. She was 16, a child in many ways, but no longer lost. Not after what she'd fought through. Not after what she'd chosen to stay alive for. When they returned home, she sat by the window sketching, while Noah napped beside her. Eli stood at the doorway, a soft smile on his lips as he watched her pencil move. "What you drawing?" he asked gently. She turned the sketch pad around. It was Shadow, lying beneath a full moon, his eyes steady, his body casting a long, protective shadow over a crib. June had written one word beneath the image. Still, the snow had melted. The town had moved forward, but not them. They didn't need to. They were the ones who stayed when others couldn't, the ones who remembered not to ache, but to anchor. Eli placed the drawing on the fridge, next to a photo of Miriam in her garden. And beside it, a crayon scribble Noah had made, mostly blue and messy, but with a rough shape that looked oddly like a dog. Shadow, probably. Or hope. Either way, it fit. The letter came on a Thursday morning. Unmarked envelope, no bold stamps, just her name, June Harper, written in a hand too neat to be bureaucratic. She hesitated opening it. Her fingers ran along the seal as if testing the weight of whatever lay inside. Across the room, Noah giggled as he dragged a wooden train along the kitchen tiles. The dog lay sprawled beside him, one eye lazily half open, tail twitching at each high-pitched laugh. Shadow didn't need to watch her. He already knew what was written. She broke the seal. The first word she saw wasn't even the one that mattered. It was congratulations. June sat down slowly, letting the letter unfold itself in her hands like it had been waiting years to breathe. The words blurred together, approved. Long term. Guardianship granted pending follow-up review, but they no longer scared her. This time, the paper wasn't telling her who she couldn't be. It was proof of who she was. She was Noah's mother now. Not because she had begged for the title, but because she had earned it through fire and nights on floors and choosing, again and again, not to disappear. She looked over to Eli, who had just walked in with 2 mugs of tea, snow still clinging to the cuffs of his coat. She handed him the letter without a word. He read it once, then again. When he looked up, there was no congratulating smile. Just that slow nod, the kind that says, "I saw you fight for this. I never stopped seeing you. You're not surviving anymore," he said quietly. "No," June whispered. "I'm not." That evening, after Noah had fallen asleep to the gentle hum of the baby monitor and the soft sound of Shadow's breathing, Eli found himself on the front porch again, the sky above him stitched with stars. Spring still held a chill, but the air no longer bit. It simply asked to be noticed. The door creaked behind him. June stepped out, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, and leaned against the porch rail, close but not crowding. "I got another letter," she said. He turned, brows lifted. "It's not about Noah, it's about you." Eli blinked. "Me?" She nodded, then passed him a second envelope, already opened. The letter was from the Department of Family Services, but informal, almost handwritten in tone. It referenced his role over the past months, his stable employment, the guardianship he had helped anchor, and then the sentence that stilled him. "Would you consider pursuing informal adoption or mentorship registration, pending your interest in maintaining permanent emotional guardianship of June Harper?" It wasn't a mandate, not even a legal move. It was a question wrapped in quiet reverence, a way of asking, do you want to keep showing up? Not as a sheriff, not as a witness, not even as a savior, but as someone who stays. He handed the letter back and said nothing for a long while. June didn't push. She just stood there, her fingers tightening on the blanket like she was holding the edges of her old life closed, waiting for the next wind to take it away. "She doesn't need a replacement father," Eli said at last. "No," June replied. "She needs someone who doesn't walk away." They didn't say anything else for a while. Then she added softer, "And neither do I." "And?" Eli looked out toward the edge of the yard, where the garden boxes Miriam once planted had begun to sprout again. Tiny green shoots poking up through the dirt, daring things, really choosing life when they could have stayed buried. He exhaled. "I don't know what I'm doing," he admitted. June gave a small smile. "Me neither, but you've been doing it anyway." Shadow stepped out onto the porch then, circling once before settling between them. He looked up at Eli, not with question, but with certainty, as if to say, "You've already chosen. Now you just need to believe it." Later that night, Eli sat by his desk, the letter open beside a photo frame turned face down for too many years. Slowly, he picked it up. It was Miriam, laughing in the old garden, her hair tucked into a messy braid, her eyes mid-squint from the sun. She never got to raise a child, never got to know what it felt like to fight beside someone who'd come through fire. But somehow, Eli felt her here, in the quiet between sentences, in the warmth Noah brought into rooms, in the steadiness June had found in her own spine. He took a pen from the drawer. At the bottom of the letter, there was a checkbox, simple, almost invisible. Willing to commit to long-term informal guardianship as mentor and anchor? He didn't check the box. He wrote beneath it, "I already have. Let this make it official," and signed his name. The house was dark save for the soft glow of a nightlight in Noah's room. The rest of the world lay curled in sleep, its dreams untroubled, unaware of what it had almost lost. In the hallway, the floorboard creaked under Eli's boots as he stepped out of his room, drawn by a sound so small it cut through silence like a breath. It was Noah's cry, a soft, uneven whimper that rose from deep inside him like a memory of being cold, of waiting to be heard. Eli paused at the doorway. Inside, moonlight spilled through the curtains, pooling across the rug in pale silver. Noah lay tangled in blankets, eyes squeezed shut, face scrunched in that raw, unguarded way only a child knows. The crib rail pressed faint marks on his arms, a reminder of how fragile he once was. Shadow stirred in the corner. He was older now, grayer around the muzzle. His gait slower, the spring gone from his step. But the moment he heard that cry, something in him awoke. The dog rose, careful not to jostle his worn hips, and padded forward. Each step was measured, quiet, but charged with purpose. Eli watched him move, heart constricting at the sight of his once proud partner slowed by time. Shadow reached the crib. He lowered his head until his whiskers brushed Noah's blanket. The infant whimpered again, tiny fists opening and closing, searching for warmth. Then Shadow did the thing he'd been made to do, the thing he'd never truly retired from. He gently nudged the baby's cheek with his nose, a careful, tender gesture. A nuzzle that said, "I'm here." Noah's crying stilled. His small chest rose and fell in softer, steadier rhythm. His eyelids fluttered open, pupils dilated, and he blinked up at the dog whose body filled half the floor. Eli stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. He knelt beside the crib, one hand resting on the wooden rail. Shadow raised his head, ears twitching, then looked back at Eli with knowing eyes. June appeared in the doorway, the soft sound of her bare feet on carpet like music. She paused, watching Shadow and Noah, the circle of safety he formed with his body. The fragile child waking to a world where he was wanted. She slipped her hand onto Eli's arm, light as a whisper. "We're here," she said. Eli nodded, gaze fixed on the two whom he'd fought so hard to protect. Shadow gave one gentle sigh and lowered his chin to rest on the edge of the crib, as if settling into a lifetime assignment. June took a careful step forward, reaching out to stroke Shadow's head. The dog closed his eyes, leaning into her touch, as if drawing strength from the same bonds that had saved Noah's life in the garbage bin all those months ago. In that moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Outside, the wind whispered against the windows. Inside, three souls, man, girl, dog, stood guard over something far more precious than justice or survival. They stood guard over life itself, fragile and new and utterly irreplaceable. And it was here, in the hush that stretched beyond time, that Eli understood what every breath, every sleepless night, and every heart pound of fear had been preparing him for. Not heroism in headlines, not medals or speeches, just this, the simple, sacred act of being present, being there when the world almost turned away. He squeezed June's hand and watched as Shadow, old yet unbowed, barked once soft, low, echoing in that quiet room like the closing note of a song. It was not a summons, not an alarm, just a single bark carried on the hush of the night saying, "I have you." Eli smiled, because some heroes speak, others bark once and never need to again. It's amazing how a single bark can echo through our hearts, reminding us that love isn't measured in words, but in the quiet moments shared between a person and a dog. German Shepherds, with their unwavering loyalty and gentle strength, teach us that trust grows in every walk, every nuzzle, every late-night vigil. Our bond with them is a two-way street of compassion. They listen to our unspoken fears, and we learn to listen to theirs. If you've ever felt that deep tug of connection and wanted to deepen it, perhaps learn a new way to communicate or simply understand your companion better, there are guides out there that feel less like lessons and more like conversations with a fellow dog lover. You might enjoy exploring a friendly resource designed to honor that human-animal bond. Sometimes the smallest step, a moment of attention or a gentle pat, can open a whole new world of trust. Why not see where that next step takes you?